The sun hemorrhaged light across the western sky, spilling crimson and bruised purple over the mesas of the New Mexico territory. It was 1891, and the land known as Juniper Bend was a hard prayer whispered between cracked lips. The wind, relentless and dry, carried the scent of scouring sagebrush and the high, lonesome sweetness of piñon smoke drifting from the chimneys of the Blue Mesa Ranch. This was the end of the line. The stage had left her 3 miles back, at a crossroads marked by nothing but a warped wooden sign pointing toward oblivion. June Mercer stood before the ranch gate, a simple barrier of lodgepole pine. She was 29, though the trail dust and a grief that had settled deep in her bones made her feel ancient. Her traveling dress, once a respectable navy blue, was powdered a uniform beige. Grit worked its way between her teeth. She gripped the handle of her single canvas valise, her knuckles white, her breath held tight in her chest. She had come here on the strength of a 3-line advertisement in an Albuquerque Gazette. Teacher wanted, board provided, Blue Mesa Ranch. The gate hinge screamed like a rabbit caught by a coyote as she pushed it open. It was a sound of violation, and she winced, expecting a dog to bark or a rifle to be leveled. Nothing. Only the low, bovine sigh of cattle settling for the night and the rhythmic thud. Thud. Thud of a hammer from a large barn set back from the main house. She walked the path, her boots sinking slightly into the soft dust. The ranch house was built of thick adobe, solid and low, as if hunkering down to survive the wind. It was not a place of delicate Eastern sensibilities. It was a fortress of practicality. As she drew closer, the hammering stopped. The silence that fell was heavy, absolute. A man emerged from the deep shadow of the barn doorway. He was tall, with shoulders that seemed to block out the remaining light. He didn't walk so much as glide, the way men do who have spent more time on horseback than on their own 2 feet. He wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt, his movements economical and slow. He was, June guessed, perhaps 35. He wore denim trousers worn pale at the knees and a simple cotton shirt, the sleeves rolled up powerful, sun-darkened forearms. He held the hammer loosely in one hand. His gaze was the calmest thing she had ever seen, the quiet of a deep river, and it rested on her without judgment, only a profound, assessing stillness. This, she knew, must be Rhett Callahan. He did not speak. He simply watched her approach, his stillness a wall she had to breach, and then the wall moved, from behind his legs, from the hay-strewn darkness of the barn. They appeared, not all at once, but in a hesitant spill, like pebbles loosened by a boot. First, a boy, perhaps 11. He was built of wire and rawhide, and he stared at her with an unnerving, hawk-like intensity. His dark hair was shaggy, and his eyes, the same deep gray as the man's, missed nothing. He was Ash. Next, a girl of 8, slighter than the boy, who moved with a dreamy lack of coordination. She held a piece of charcoal and was already looking down, tracing the line of June's shadow in the dirt, as if cataloging it. This was Ren, then a smaller boy, 6 or so, who vibrated with a trapped energy, bouncing on the balls of his bare feet, his face smudged with what might have been molasses. Tavo, finally, a tiny girl, no older than 3, stumbled out, clutching a rag doll that was missing one button eye. Her face was sticky with tears, her lower lip trembling as she looked at June, this new and unwelcome shape in her world, Pippa. The 4 children formed a staggered, defensive line behind the man, a silent, waiting jury. June Mercer stopped 10 feet from them. The wind whipped a strand of her brown hair across her face, and she resisted the urge to tuck it away. Fearing any sudden movement, she had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it on the long train ride from Boston, practiced it in the rattling stagecoach, and mouthed it during the 3-mile walk. In the East, it was a confession whispered to doctors, a source of shame and pitying glances from married women. Out here, she sensed, it must be a statement of fact, a boundary line drawn clearly in the dust. She cleared her throat, the grit scraping. "Mr. Callahan," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. He gave a single, slow nod, acknowledging his name. "My name is June Mercer. I've come about the advertisement for the teaching position." He nodded again, his eyes still on her, weighing the exhaustion, the respectable but worn dress, the single valise that spoke of a life shed, or a life with little to shed at all. June took a breath. This was the part that mattered, the part that had cost her 2 other, less desperate positions. Before I take up any more of your time," she said, forcing herself to meet that calm, river-deep gaze, "there is something you must know. It is a fact that pertains to women and families." A flicker of something not impatience, just curiosity moved in his eyes. "I cannot have children, sir. A medical matter. From some years ago, I am barren." The word hung in the air, ugly and final. She felt the hawk-eyed boy, Ash, stiffen, his gaze sharpening with a premature understanding. The little girl, Pippa, let out a fresh, hiccuping sob. June felt the familiar cold dread rise in her stomach. She had spoken her truth, and now would come the inevitable, polite dismissal. He needed a teacher. Yes, but ranchers with 4 children, 4 motherless children. She now realized with a jolt were always looking for something more. A wife in waiting. A replacement. She, June Mercer, was medically, irrevocably incomplete. Rhett Callahan looked at her for a long, silent moment. The sun finally dipped below the mesa, plunging the yard into a sudden, cool twilight. He looked from June's face, pale with stored tension, to the 4 small heads huddled near his waist. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but the barest hint of one. A warmth entered his voice, a low timbre that felt like a hand resting on a skittish horse. "Good," he said. June blinked. The word did not compute. "Sir, good," Rhett repeated, his voice calm and certain. "I've got enough kids for both of us." June Mercer's breath, which she had held for what felt like 3 states and a territory, escaped her in a rush. She felt a sudden, absurd lightness in her head. Her knees, locked rigid for an hour, threatened to buckle. A profound silence descended, different from the one before. It was not a silence of assessment, but of acceptance. The space between them, which had been charged with her confession, suddenly felt vast and peaceful. The only sounds were the distant, melodic clanging of a cattle bell and the dry, papery rustle of the high grasses beyond the fence. The space stretched, then it closed, not with a word, but with a simple gesture. Rhett Callahan gave her that same slow, definitive nod. It was a nod of trust. "A contract sealed?" "You're hired, Miss Mercer," he said. June swallowed, nodding back, unable to find her voice. She had braced for pity, for rejection. She had not braced for practicality. She had not braced for relief. "I can start tomorrow," she managed. "I saw the advertisement mention board. I can teach on the porch. I won't be a bother to your household." Rhett looked at the wide, wind-blasted porch, then back at her. "Porch gets the afternoon sun. You'll bake, and the wind'll take the pages." He gestured with the hammer toward the main house. "The parlor." "No one uses it but the spiders." He turned and, without checking to see if she followed, moved toward the house. The children parted for him like water around a stone, then closed ranks behind him, their eyes all 4 pairs fixed on June. She picked up her valise, the handle now slick in her palm, and followed them. The parlor was cool and smelled of dust, dried herbs, and old wood. It was sparse, furnished with 2 severe-looking chairs and a small sofa leaking its stuffing, but in the corner, June saw it, and her heart gave a strange, hopeful leap. It was a large piece of slate, chipped at the edges, nailed directly to the adobe wall. Beneath it, resting on a small, 3-legged stool, was a pine table, its surface sanded smooth but clearly homemade, a blackboard. He had built them a blackboard. Rhett set the hammer on the mantel of the cold fireplace. He didn't introduce the children. He didn't need to. They were there, a silent, watchful mass in the doorway. June turned to face them. They stared at her with a raw, almost feral curiosity. It wasn't the polite diffidence of Eastern children. This was the gaze of survivors. There was no hostility in it, not yet, but a deep, ingrained caution. The caution of those who had lost, and who expected to lose again. June set her valise down slowly. She knew this ground. This was the part she was good at. She crouched, wincing as her stiff skirts protested, bringing herself down to their level. She looked past the suspicious hawk stare of Ash, past the dreamy focus of Wren, and settled her gaze on Tavo, the energetic one. "My name is June," she said, her voice soft. "I'm here to teach you your letters, but I won't force you." Ash scoffed. "A tiny, sharp sound. Don't need letters to rope a steer." "No," June agreed, her voice remaining even. "You don't, but you need them to know if the man buying your steers is cheating you on the bill of sale." Ash's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected that. June smiled, a small, tired curving of her lips. "We won't do boring drills. I'll just tell you stories. Stories about how the letter S is just a sidewinder snake sunning itself, and the letter C is the curve of a new horseshoe." Wren, the map drawer, tilted her head, her interest snagged by the shapes. Tavo took one cautious step into the room. Pippa, the smallest, still hid behind Rhett's leg. Her crying subsided to a watery sniffle. "That'll do for introductions." Rhett's voice came from above them. "Ash, show Miss Mercer to the guest room. Tavo, fetch the water pump. Wren, see to Pippa." The children scattered, their unity broken by his quiet commands. Ash gave June one last, lingering look of suspicion before jerking his chin toward a hallway. The room was small. At the back of the house, it contained a narrow iron bedstead, a washstand with a ceramic pitcher and bowl, and a single wooden chair. It was monastic, but it was clean. "Supper's at 7, Ash said from the doorway, his voice flat, repeating an order. And then he was gone. June sat on the edge of the cot. The mattress crackled, filled with straw or corn husks. She looked at her hands. The grime settled into the lines of her palms. She should wash. She should unpack her one spare dress. But for a moment, she just sat, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, the clank of a bucket, Rhett's low voice giving an order in the yard, the scuffle of small feet. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the journey and the confrontation. She had made it. She had a place. It was a start. An hour later, hunger finally drove her from the room. She followed the hallway to the heart of the house, a large kitchen, warm and bright, and she stopped dead in the doorway. No one was there. The room was empty. But a kerosene lamp, its chimney polished, was already lit on the center table, casting a pool of buttery yellow light. It wasn't the dim light of a lamp turned down low. It was the bright, steady flame of a lamp lit for someone. On the edge of the massive, cast-iron stove, which still radiated a gentle warmth, sat a tin mug of milk. A small cloth was wrapped around it, not to keep it warm, but to keep the evening chill of the high desert from cooling it too quickly. It was a gesture of consideration. Silent, practical, unadorned. It was Rhett Callahan's. She knew, no one else's. It was the same practical kindness as his good. June Mercer walked to the stove. She touched the tin mug. It was still lukewarm. She unwrapped the cloth. All her life, she had been the one tending, the one anticipating needs. Since the verdict in that Boston doctor's office, she had felt like a ghost, a perpetual visitor in the lives of families she could never have. But this was different. This was the first time in more years than she could count that she had felt the sensation of being waited for. A strange, unfamiliar ache spread through her chest, a feeling so long dormant she barely recognized it. It was a fragile warmth, pushing back against the old, cold hollowness. She lifted the mug and drank. The milk was rich and sweet. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the adobe walls of the Blue Mesa Ranch, June Mercer stood in the lamplight, and for the first time, she felt the anchor of her wandering life catch on solid ground, The first dawn at Blue Mesa Ranch broke cold and sharp, the light a pale blade across the adobe floor. June was awake before it, her body still humming with the traveler's anxiety. She dressed in the chill, her fingers stiff, and made her way to the kitchen. It was empty, but the great stove was already alive, its iron belly radiating a low, steady heat. Rhett was already long gone, the sound of his axe splitting juniper rounds echoing from the wood pile. She found the cornmeal atajo, the locals called it, and a heavy pot. She began to make mush, stirring the yellow grit into the simmering water, feeling the weight of the silence. This was the first test. She was not a cook by nature. She was a woman of books and chalk dust. One by one, they trickled in. Tavo, his hair standing up in a wild black crest, sniffing the air. Ren, quiet as smoke, sliding onto the bench. Ash, last, his boots already dusty, his eyes critical as he watched her stir. He expected failure. She served the mush. It was thick, perhaps too thick, but she had added a spoonful of hoarded brown sugar and a dot of precious butter. Tavo ate his with rapid, hungry scoops. Ren ate delicately. Ash poured molasses over his in a deluge, as if to drown the taste, but he ate every bite. Pippa, in Rhett's arms as he finally entered, his face shining from the wash pump, ate what he spoon-fed her. No one spoke. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons on pottery. After, June took the slate and a piece of chalk to the porch. The children followed, not because they were told, but because she was the new, strange object in their landscape. "This," she said, drawing a long, curving line in the dust with a stick, "is the snake, the S," Tavo giggled. "And this," she drew a circle, "is the moon. Oh," Ash kicked at the dirt. "That's stupid." "Is it?" June asked, not looking up. "The moon tells you the tide, tells you when to plant. A circle keeps the heat in a fire pit. Shapes have power. Ash, letters are just shapes that talk." She left the stick. She went inside to help clear the plates. When she came back out, Ash and Tavo were gone, chasing a lizard. But Ren was there, squatting by the drawing. With one small finger, she was tracing a new shape in the dust. Next to June's, a long line down, with a little hook, a J. June pretended not to see, her heart kicking softly against her ribs. The second day, she brought out her arsenal. 3 books, their bindings cracked and soft from travel. A primer, a thin volume of poetry, and a geography of the American territories. Ash, who had been tasked with mending a bridle on the porch, watched her from the corner of his eye. "Books," he said, the word an accusation. "Don't need books." "No," June agreed, opening the geography. "But a man who knows his letters can write to the cavalry for help. A man who knows his numbers can't be cheated. A man who knows his maps." She paused. "Knows where he is." She opened to a map of the New Mexico territory. It was colored in pale yellow and green, the mountains like fuzzy caterpillars, the river's thin blue veins. Ash squinted. He put down the leather strap. He walked over, his suspicion a palpable force. He pointed a dirt-caked finger at a spot southwest of Juniper Bend. "That's wrong," he said, his voice sharp with the pleasure of finding a flaw. "Is it?" June asked. "Yes, sir. That blue line you call the Arroyo Seco. It's been dry since '88. And that's not where the Dragon's Tooth Mesa is. It's further south. You got it all wrong." He looked triumphant. A lesser teacher would have argued. A lesser woman would have felt the sting of being corrected by a boy of 11. June felt a slow smile build. She picked up the piece of charcoal she used for the slate. "I see," she said gravely. "The man who drew this map in Boston clearly never had to find water in a dry season. Would you fix it for me? Show me where the land really is." She offered him the charcoal. Ash froze. He stared at the black stick as if it were a snake. He looked at her, searching for a trick. Finding none, he snatched it. He crouched over the book, his dark hair falling over his face, and began to draw. His strokes sure and angry, correcting the ignorance of the world. He was twisting the brim of his worn hat in his other hand, a gesture she already recognized as his signal for deep, anxious concentration. Wren, meanwhile, had discovered the poetry. She couldn't read the words, but she was tracing the shape of the stanzas. Her head tilted, a single strand of her fine hair pulled taut between her fingers as she thought. By the third day, the rhythm was set. The morning began not with silence, but with questions. Tavo, the vibrating, kinetic boy, sprinted onto the porch, his small fist clutched tight. Miss June, I got you a present." He spoke in a rush, the words tumbling over each other in his haste, a habit she realized he fell into when he was excited or afraid. He opened his hand. In his palm sat a tiny, perfect, sun-bleached desert snail shell, a treasure found among the yucca. "Tavo, it's beautiful," she said, accepting it as gravely as if it were a diamond. He beamed. His fear of her presence finally burned away by the pride of his gift. That afternoon, the heat was a heavy blanket. June sat on the porch step, reading from the primer in a low monotone, letting the cadence of the words lull them. Tavo was drawing his snail shell on the slate. Wren was meticulously coloring Ash's map corrections with crushed petals and berries. Ash was rebuilding the bridle, pointedly, not listening, though his hands paused every time she turned a page. Pippa, the smallest, the one whose tears had greeted her, had been watching June with wide, solemn eyes. Slowly, tentatively, she had crept closer. She sat on the step below June, then leaned back. A moment later, June felt a small, warm weight settle against her knee. Pippa had leaned her head on June's thigh. June continued reading, her voice not faltering, though her entire body went rigid. A minute passed. The child's breathing deepened. June looked down. Pippa was fast asleep, her grubby hand loosely holding a fold of June's dusty skirt. June did not move for an hour. She sat there, the desert sun beating down, a cramp forming in her leg, and felt the simple, profound weight of the child's trust. It was a heavier and more precious burden than her valise had ever been. Rhett found them that way when he rode in from the high pasture. He stopped his horse, the leather of his saddle creaking. He looked at the scene on his porch, the sleeping child, the boy mending tack, the girl drawing maps, the other boy practicing his letters. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He dismounted, walked past them into the parlor, and stood before the homemade blackboard. June had written the alphabet on it, her handwriting clean and precise. Rhett stood there for a long moment. Then, he reached out and touched the pine frame. He ran one calloused, scarred finger down the sanded edge, a carpenter testing his own work. He turned, met June's eyes across the yard, and gave one short, definitive nod. It was the loudest praise she had ever received. She was learning them. She saw them not as a group, but as individuals, each with their own language of grief. Ash, with his hat twisting, was a boy forced to be a man, his pride a shield for his fear of failing. Wren, with her hair pulling, lived in a world of shapes he couldn't control, trying to draw order onto the chaos. Tavo's rapid-fire speech was a dam trying to hold back a flood of energy. And Pippa's grief was the rawest. That night, June woke to a sound, a floorboard. The house was bathed in moonlight, cold and blue. She sat up. The door to the children's room was open. Pippa was standing in the main room, her thin nightgown a ghostly white. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the front door. She was sleepwalking. "Mama," she whispered to the door. "Mama, cold." June felt her own breath catch. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cool adobe. She didn't call the child's name, knowing the shock could be harmful. She moved slowly, coming up behind the girl. "It's all right," she murmured, her voice low. "I'm here." She scooped the girl into her arms. Pippa's body was rigid, caught in the grip of the dream. She began to struggle, a small, panicked sound rising in her throat. "Shh," June whispered, holding her close, walking her back toward the bedroom. She needed a sound, a comfort. She reached back into her own memory, to the dark days after her surgery in Santa Fe. to the wrinkled, kind face of the curandera, the old Mexican nurse who had tended to her. The nurse would sing when the pain was bad. June began to hum, then to sing the words, her Spanish halting but the melody true. Duérmete, mi niña, duérmete mi sol. Sleep, my girl, sleep, my son. She sang the simple verse over and over, slowly. The rigidity left Pippa's limbs. The child's breathing, which had been fast and shallow, deepened. The terror receded. Pippa's head grew heavy, sinking against June's collarbone. June laid her back in the small bed she shared with Wren. She tucked the quilt around her small shoulders. Wren hadn't even stirred. June sat on the floor beside them, her own heart aching, until the silver moonlight faded to the gray of pre-dawn. A few nights later, the children were long asleep. A chill had descended, a reminder that the high desert was not a gentle place. June was by the fire in the main room, darning a hole in Tavo's sock. Rhett sat opposite her, working on a small shirt. A seam had ripped clear open. He was trying to sew it, but his large, powerful hands, so adept with rope and iron, were clumsy with a needle. He held it pinched between his thumb and forefinger, pushing it through the thick fabric with a wince, jabbing his own finger repeatedly. He swore, a low, frustrated sound under his breath. June watched him for a moment. He was a man drowning in a teacup, too proud to ask for help. She did not smile. She did not offer to do it for him. She simply reached into her sewing basket and pulled out a small, metal thimble. She stood, walked the few feet that separated them, and held it out. "This will guard your finger," she said quietly. Rhett looked up, his face set in a mask of frustration. His eyes met hers. He looked at the thimble, then at her hand. He reached out to take it, his calloused, scarred fingers, smelling of forge smoke and leather, brushed the skin of her palm. It was nothing. It was everything. A jolt, hot and sudden as a lightning strike, passed between them. It was a static shock from a dry land, a sudden, searing recognition of skin against skin. June's breath hitched. Rhett's hand recoiled, as if burned. He snatched the thimble without his fingers touching hers again. "Thank you," he muttered, his voice gravelly. He turned his attention back to the shirt, his neck red. June returned to her chair, her hand tingling. The air in the room was suddenly thick, charged. The only sound was the pop of the piñon logs and the scrape as Rhett, his finger now protected, forced the needle through the cloth. The ranch had a heartbeat, and it was the sound of Rhett's forge. Most afternoons, the rhythmic clang. Clang. Clang of his hammer striking the anvil echoed from the smithy he'd built near the creek. It was the sound of function, of repair, of staying. June began to use it. "Listen," she told the children. Gathered on the porch, the hammer rang out. "SH," she said, drawing the letters. "Song, este, stay," Wren whispered, tasting the word. "Stay," Tavo shouted, matching the hammer's beat. Ash just listened, his face impassive, but his foot tapped in time. The world intruded, as it always does. A wagon rolled up, driven by a woman whose face was a map of the territory, sun-scorched and resilient. "May Travers," the woman introduced herself, handing June a loaf of cornbread still warm from the oven. From the Cross Creek spread, heard Rhett had found a teacher. May's eyes were not unkind, but they were sharp. They took in June's mended dress, her clean hands, the children clustered behind her. It was the look June had seen on the faces of women her entire life, the "how long will you last" look. "It's a hard life out here for, well," May said, gesturing vaguely. "For anyone. We've seen folks come and go. This land chews up the ones who aren't tough enough." "It is a hard land," June agreed. Accepting the bread, she would not be dismissed. "That's why the children need their letters all the more. I'll be holding an open class, Fridays, for any child in Juniper Bend who can make the ride. No charge." May's eyebrows shot up. This was not the answer she expected. She looked from June's steady gaze to the children hiding behind her skirt, and a new respect dawned in her eyes. "Well, I'll be Friday, you say. That night, in her small room, June found it. Tucked on a peg behind the door was a bundle of soft wool yarn and 2 knitting needles, a child's shawl, half finished. The stitches were desperately tight, as if the knitter had been trying to hold something together that was falling apart. A previous tutor, perhaps, or someone else. June sat on her cot, the wool in her lap. It was a life interrupted, a task left undone. She examined the last row, tight and angry. She gently, respectfully, pulled the needles out and unraveled the last few rows. Loosening the tension, then she slipped the loops back onto the needles. Her hands found the familiar, ancient rhythm. Knit, purl. Her own stitches were even, sure, she was not just passing time. She was continuing a thread. She was mending a life left broken. The next morning, she opened her door. The house was dark. Rhett already gone to the forge. On the floor, just outside her threshold, sat a single, battered tin cup. She picked it up. It was not the milk from the first night. It was water, warmed on the stove. Not hot enough to scald, not cold enough to shock, just warm. A simple, profound, daily act of care. He had not forgotten her. He would not let her wake to a cold room and a dry throat. June leaned her head against the doorframe, the cup warming her hands. It was a promise, made in silence. It said, "You are here, you are seen, you will stay." The afternoon heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the shimmering dust of the Ocotillo patch. The spiny, whip-like branches of the plants reached for the brassy sky like 1,000 thorny arms. It was a place of stark, dangerous beauty, and Wren loved it. She was sketching the strange, skeletal shapes in her notebook, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, while her pony, a placid buckskin named Dusty, grazed nearby. The world shattered in a single, violent moment. A rattlesnake, sunning itself on a warm rock, gave its dry, terrifying buzz. Dusty, for all his placidness, was still a creature of instinct. He shrieked, reared, and bolted. The reins, which Wren had carelessly looped over her arm, snapped taut. She was yanked from her feet, airborne for a split second, a small, ragdoll figure against the vast, indifferent blue. She landed hard. The scream that tore from her throat was not a child's cry. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, thin and sharp, and it sliced through the heavy afternoon silence, reaching the ranch house with the speed of a bullet. Rhett was the first to hear it. He was at the forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer a steady heartbeat for the ranch. He dropped the hammer mid-swing. It hit the packed earth with a dead thud. His head snapped up, his face a mask of instant, animalistic alarm. He knew his children's voices better than he knew his own name. That was Wren, and that was the sound of pain. June was on the porch with the other children. She saw the look on Rhett's face, saw him break into a dead run toward the Ocotillo field, and her blood went cold. Ash was on his feet a second later, his face pale, his hawk eyes wide with fear. "Stay here," June commanded Tavo and Pippa, her voice sharp with an authority she didn't know she possessed. She ran after Rhett, her skirts catching on the sagebrush, her heart hammering against her ribs. They found Wren crumpled at the base of a tall Ocotillo, a heap of calico and dust. She was conscious, her face chalk white and slick with sweat, her eyes enormous with shock and pain. Her left arm was bent at an angle that was sickeningly wrong, the small, delicate bone clearly broken just below the elbow. Rhett reached her first. He fell to his knees beside her, his big hands hovering uselessly over his daughter's small frame. "Wren, honey," he choked out, his voice thick with a panic June had never imagined from this impossibly calm man. "Oh, God, okay, we need a splint." He looked around wildly, his eyes scanning the ground. He picked up a piece of fallen Ocotillo branch, then threw it down. Too brittle. He grabbed a flat stone, too heavy. For the first time since she had arrived, June saw Rhett Callahan completely unmoored, the man who could build a house, forge a tool, and command a herd of cattle was utterly lost in the face of his child's broken body. His hands, usually so steady and capable, were shaking. That was when something inside June shifted. The teacher, the quiet observer, receded. The part of her forged in the sterile, quiet rooms of a Santa Fe hospital. The part that had learned the cold, hard mechanics of the human body through her own suffering, took over. "Rhett," she said. Her voice was low, clear, and absolutely steady. "Look at me." He tore his frantic gaze from the ground and looked at her. His eyes were wide with a father's terror. "Hold her other hand," June commanded gently. "Talk to her. Tell her about the stars. Don't look at her arm. Just look at her face and talk." He stared at her for a second. Then a flicker of understanding, of relief at being given a task, crossed his face. He nodded, taking Wren's uninjured right hand in both of his. "Hey, Wren bird," he began, his voice still rough but finding a rhythm. "You remember what I told you about Cassiopeia, the queen, in her chair?" June moved to Wren's other side. "Wren, my sweet," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "This is going to hurt very much for just a moment, but I will be quick. You have to be the bravest girl in the whole territory. Can you do that for me?" Wren, her teeth chattering, gave a tiny, tear-streaked nod. Without hesitation, June took the hem of her sturdy cotton apron and ripped a long, wide strip from it. Then another. She had no splint, no board. She looked around, her mind racing. Yucca. The broad, fibrous leaves were stiff, like bone themselves. She ran to a nearby plant and, ignoring the sharp points, broke off 2 of the thickest leaves. By now, Ash had arrived. He stood frozen, his face a mess of fear and the desperate need to do something. "Ash," June said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Stand right there. The wind is picking up. Block the dust. Don't let it get in her eyes." Ash immediately squared his shoulders, planting his feet and turning his small, wiry body into a human windbreak. He stared out at the horizon, his jaws set, a sentinel on duty. Tavo and Pippa had followed, their small faces stricken. Tavo, seeing Ash's purpose, instinctively wrapped his arms around Pippa, who had started to cry, and pulled her back, burying her face in his small shoulder, shielding her from the scene. They were a family, and in a crisis, they operated like a single, cohesive unit. June knelt again. She placed the yucca leaves on either side of Wren's forearm. "All right, Rhett, squeeze her hand now," she said softly. She took a deep breath, placed one hand on Wren's elbow and the other on her wrist. She looked at the unnatural angle, the geography of the break. She closed her eyes for a split second, picturing the diagrams from the medical texts she had devoured in her recovery. Then she pulled. There was a sickening, grating sound, a sound of bone scraping bone, and a single, sharp scream from Wren that was abruptly cut off as she fainted. But the arm was straight, working with a speed born of pure adrenaline. June laid the yucca leaves against the straightened forearm and began to wrap it tightly with the strips of her apron. Her knots firm and efficient, she had created a functional, if primitive, splint. She looked up, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands shaking now that the worst was over. Rhett was staring at her. The stories about the stars had died on his lips. His face was pale, his eyes wide. But the look in them was not just awe. It was not mere gratitude. It was a look of profound, world-altering recognition. In that moment, he wasn't seeing a hired teacher who had proven useful. He was seeing the steady center that his chaotic, motherless family had desperately needed and never had. He was seeing a woman who did not fall apart when the world broke, but who instead began methodically putting the pieces back together. He was seeing a home. He was seeing the answer to a prayer he hadn't even known how to utter. "This family needs you." The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. "We need you." He gently scooped the unconscious Wren into his arms. "Ash," he said, his voice hoarse. "Ride. Get Doctor. Calderon. Ride like the devil is on your heels." Ash didn't need to be told twice. He was gone, a flash of denim and determination, sprinting for the corral. They carried Wren back to the house and laid her on the sofa in the parlor. She was starting to stir, moaning softly, a feverish heat already radiating from her skin. Hours later, as twilight bled into the sky, a buggy clattered into the yard. A woman in a dusty black dress, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, strode into the house carrying a worn leather bag. This was Dr. Inez Calderon, a woman whose reputation was as formidable as the land itself. She was sharp, brusque, and tolerated no fools. She went straight to Wren, her clever brown eyes taking in the pale, feverish child in the makeshift splint. "Who did this?" she asked, her fingers gently probing the wrapping. "I did," June said, stepping forward. "Doctor." Calderon looked June up and down, her gaze assessing. "You have training. I spent time in a hospital. I read. I watched." June answered honestly. The doctor grunted. She carefully unwrapped a small portion of the bandage, her touch surprisingly gentle. She felt the alignment of the bone beneath. She nodded, a short, sharp gesture of approval. "It will hold. Good work. Clean set. You saved her from a lifetime of pain." She looked at Rhett. "This one's got sense. Don't lose her." She turned back to June. "The fever is from the shock and the pain. I'll leave you some powders, but what she needs is creosote tea. Steep the leaves, make it bitter. It'll fight the inflammation. Keep her cool." She gave her instructions, packed her bag, accepted a silver dollar from Rhett, and was gone as quickly as she had come. That night, the house was submerged in a deep, watchful quiet. The only sounds were Wren's shallow, feverish breaths from the parlor and the hiss of the kerosene lamp in the kitchen. Ash, Tavo, and Pippa were asleep, exhausted by the day's terror. June sat by the sofa, bathing Wren's forehead with a cool, damp cloth. Rhett stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the lamplight, watching her. The silence stretched, filled with the unspoken events of the day. Finally, he walked in and sat in the chair opposite her. He looked at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "I froze," he said to his hands. The confession was quiet, raw. "A man's supposed to know what to do. I didn't know what to do." "You are her father," June said softly. "It is a father's right to be terrified for his child." He looked up at her then, his calm gaze shadowed with a vulnerability she had never seen. "They're not by blood. They're not." June stopped wiping Wren's brow, her hand hovering in the air. "I found them," Rhett said, his voice a low rumble. "Over the years, on cattle drives. Ash, his folks took a fever near the Brazos. Found him trying to water their horses. He was 7. He swallowed, the memory raw. Wren and Tavo. Their mother was a laundress in a trail town. She just walked away one morning. Left them in an alley with a piece of bread. He paused, his jaw working. Pippa. She was the last, just a baby, left on a church step in Sable Mesa. "I was delivering horses. The Reverend didn't know what to do with her." He looked at June, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I couldn't just leave them, June. It didn't seem right. To just ride on." June's heart felt as if it were swelling in her chest. A painful, beautiful ache. She said nothing. There were no words for a love that profound, for a compassion that vast. A sermon on charity would have been an insult to the quiet, powerful truth of his actions. Her eyes fell to his hand, resting on his knee. There was a long, angry scratch on the back of it, red and beaded with blood, from where he had scrambled through the thorny brush to get to Wren. She stood, went to the kitchen, and came back with a small basin of clean water and a strip of linen from her sewing basket. She knelt before him. Without a word, she took his large, calloused hand in hers. He flinched, but didn't pull away. Gently, she washed the dirt and blood from the scratch. She dried it with a corner of the cloth, then carefully wrapped the clean linen around his hand, tying a neat, small bow. Her touch was light, clinical, and yet it was the most intimate gesture of her life. She was not just tending a wound. She was answering his confession. She was saying, without words, I see you. I understand. The weight you carry. Let me help you bear it. He stared at their joined hands, his breath unsteady. From the darkness outside, a coyote yipped, its call answered by another, then another, until the night was filled with their wild, lonely chorus. It was not a threatening sound. It was the sound of the territory, a song of survival. And tonight it sounded like a witness, a wild amen to the unspoken covenant being forged within the adobe walls. June rose and went back to her vigil. A few moments later, Pippa, asleep in the other room, whimpered. In the grip of a dream, she murmured a single, heartbreaking word. Mama. June felt the sting of tears behind her eyes. A familiar, bitter grief. She swallowed it down. She looked at Wren, feverish and pale, at Rhett, his hand bandaged, his soul laid bare, and she knew her answer was not for the ghost of a woman she could never be. It was for the living, breathing child in the next room, for all of them. She leaned close to Wren's ear, her voice a promise whispered into the dark. Quiet house, an answer meant for everyone. I'm here. She sat that way all night, changing the cloths, listening to the breathing of the house. Just before the first hint of dawn, Wren's restless tossing stilled. June placed a hand on her forehead. The burning heat was gone. The fever had broken. Wren's eyes fluttered open. They were clear. She looked at June, and a small, sleepy, trusting smile touched her lips. June smiled back, her own face wet with tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. Outside, the sky was turning from gray to rose, promising a new day. The peace that had settled over the Blue Mesa Ranch was as fragile as a desert flower. For 3 weeks after Wren's accident, a quiet, hopeful rhythm had taken hold. The sound of June's lessons blended with the clang of Rhett's hammer. Wren's arm was healing in a neat, straight line, and the cast of fear had slowly lifted from the children's faces. The house, once a fortress of silent grief, was beginning to feel like a home. Then, 2 riders appeared on the horizon. They did not approach with the easy, ambling gait of a neighbor. They rode with purpose, their backs straight, their horses moving at a steady, official trot that kicked up 2 plumes of dust. The children, playing a game of tag in the yard, fell silent and scurried to the porch, seeking the shelter of June's skirts. Rhett emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his body instantly alert. His calm eyes narrowed. One rider was a man, young and lean, wearing a tin star on his vest that glinted cruelly in the noon sun. This was Silas Rudd, the new deputy out of Sable Mesa, a man whose face was still too smooth for the harshness of the territory. The other rider was a woman, seated ramrod straight in a man's saddle. She was of middle age, dressed in a severe, joyless black dress, her face pinched into a permanent expression of disapproval. June felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. This was the world intruding. This was the law, and the law rarely came to places like this to bring good news. The riders dismounted. The woman did not wait for the deputy's assistance. She slid from her horse with a grim efficiency and marched toward the porch, a leather portfolio clutched in her gloved hand. "Rhett Callahan?" she asked, her voice as dry and brittle as last year's corn husks. It was not a question, but a confirmation. "I'm Callahan," Rhett said, his voice a low rumble. He moved to stand slightly in front of June and the children, a living shield. "I am Mrs. Prudence Fair, of the Territorial Benevolence Committee," she announced, the title sounding more like an indictment. "This is Deputy Silas Rudd. We are here on official business regarding the wards residing at this location." She did not look at the children. She referred to them as if they were items in an inventory. She opened her portfolio and produced a document bearing an imposing wax seal. She began to read, her voice a flat, merciless monotone. "Pursuant to Territorial Mandate 74, regarding the welfare and disposition of orphaned and abandoned minors, it has come to the committee's attention that 4 such wards, Asher Cobb, Wren and Tavo Briggs, and an infant known as Pippa, are being housed in an unlegitimized guardianship." Rhett's body went rigid. June put a hand on Ash's shoulder, feeling the boy trembling with a sudden, violent anger. The law is unequivocal. Mrs. Fair continued, her eyes scanning the page, avoiding any human contact. Guardianship of wards of the territory can only be granted to legal next of kin or to a state-sanctioned institution, as you, Mr. Callahan, are of no blood relation to any of the aforementioned children. Your guardianship is hereby deemed invalid. She looked up then, her cold, gray eyes finally meeting Rhett's. You will have a period of 10 days to prepare the children for transport. They are to be remanded to the custody of the Saguaro Foundling Home in Santa Fe. The words fell into the sun-drenched silence of the yard, and the world seemed to stop. 10 days. Santa Fe. The names were a death sentence. Rhett stood perfectly still for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he took off his hat. He gripped the brim, his knuckles turning white, the thick veins standing out on the back of his hand. He was a man holding on to the last piece of a world that was being torn from his grasp. June stepped forward. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs, but her voice was as calm and clear as a winter morning. Mrs. Fair, she said. May I see that document? Prudence Fair's thin eyebrows rose in surprise. She had expected tears, pleading, or perhaps a man's angry outburst. She had not expected this quiet, steady schoolteacher to challenge her. She hesitated, then handed the paper over. June read it quickly, her mind racing. The language was dense, legalistic, designed to intimidate and overwhelm, but she had spent her life with words. She knew their power and their tricks. This mandate seems to grant the committee significant discretionary power, June said, looking up. It mentions, in the best interest of the child. Surely it cannot be in their best interest to be uprooted from the only stable home they have ever known. Stability, Mrs. Fair sniffed, is determined by the law, not by sentiment. They will receive structured care, religious instruction, and preparation for a life of useful service. What you call structured care, I call a barracks, June replied, her voice still even but now edged with steel. We are providing them with an education, a trade, and a family. Is there no process for appeal? No petition for a formal review? Mrs. Fair snatched the document back. The committee's decision is final. You are a hired teacher, Miss Mercer, a transient. You have no standing in this matter. She looked June up and down, her gaze dismissive and insulting. You are not their mother. The words were meant to wound, to put June back in her place, but they ignited a fire in her, a fierce, protective inferno. June took a step closer, her eyes locked on the woman's. You are correct, madam. I did not give them birth, but I am the one who sat with Wren all night when her arm was broken and the fever was high. I am the one who holds Pippa when she cries for a mother she can't remember. I am the one who is teaching Ash to read so he can protect himself in a world that has already taken everything from him. Being a mother is not a matter of blood. It is a matter of showing up, and I am here. This is my place. A flush of angry color rose in Prudence Fair's cheeks. She was unaccustomed to being challenged. Deputy Rudd shifted his weight, his gaze dropping to the dust at his feet, a silent testament to his discomfort. The law's the law. Mrs. Fair snapped. 10 days. She turned on her heel and marched back to her horse. Silas Rudd gave Red a brief, almost apologetic glance, then followed. They rode away, leaving their dust and their verdict hanging in the air. The bad news spread through Juniper Bend like a prairie fire. It traveled with the ranch hand who delivered supplies, was whispered over the bar at the saloon, and became the somber topic of conversation after Reverend Amos Pike's Sunday sermon. And with the news came the poison of gossip. Always knew there was something strange about it. A man named Henderson muttered into his beer. Callahan, taking in strays like that. He's just breeding his own ranch hands, cheaper than hiring 'em. His companion nodded sagely. That's the truth of it. Working 'em to the bone, I'll wager. A chair scraped back from a nearby table. May Travers, who had come into town for flour, stood over them, her face thunderous. You say one more word against Rhett Callahan, Henderson, and I'll pour that beer down the front of your shirt, she said, her voice low and dangerous. The saloon fell quiet. I was there last fall when my boy Tom helped Rhett mend a fence line. Rhett paid him a full day's wage in cornmeal and sent him home with a wool coat he'd bought himself. Said Tom was too thin for the winter. Rhett Callahan is a better man than the whole lot of you put together. He's raising a family, not a workforce. She stared them down until they both found something fascinating to look at in the bottom of their glasses. At the church, the tone was more sorrowful but no less divided. It's the law, one of the deacons said with a helpless shrug. Perhaps it is for the best. The children will be with professionals. Reverend Amos Pike, a kind man with a spine of hickory, cleared his throat. The law of man is not always the law of God, he said, his voice carrying across the small gathering. He opened his worn Bible. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. Rhett Callahan has been living that scripture. It is our duty as a community to stand with him, not to look away and cite statutes. Back at the ranch, despair had settled in like a physical illness. Rhett paced the length of the parlor, his long strides like those of a caged wolf. The children were huddled together on the sofa, a small island of silent misery. I'll sell the breeding stock, Rhett said suddenly, stopping his pacing. His face was grim. The Hereford bull, the yearlings, it'll be enough. We can get a lawyer, a real one from Santa Fe. We can fight them. June, who had been sitting quietly at the table, her mind a whirlwind of strategy, looked up at him. His plan was born of desperation, a desire to do something, anything. It was a plan to fight fire with fire, but she knew it was wrong. Rhett, no, she said, her voice firm. He turned to her, his eyes blazing with a frustrated, helpless anger. What else is there? June, we have 10 days. I'll sell the whole damn ranch if I have to. Listen to me, she said, rising and walking to him. She placed a hand on his arm, forcing him to be still. Don't sell the roof before we've built the walls. He stared at her, uncomprehending. They are attacking us on the grounds of the law, she explained, her voice gaining strength and passion. A lawyer in Santa Fe will file papers, and those papers will be answered with more papers. We'll be buried in legal documents until the 10 days are gone. We cannot win by fighting their battle. We must fight our own. And what battle is that? He asked, his voice rough with despair. The truth, she said simply. Their entire case is built on a lie. The lie is that these children are neglected wards. We will prove that they are a thriving, well-cared-for family. We will not fight them with money. We will fight them with ink and paper and facts. We will build a wall of evidence so high they cannot climb over it. For the first time since the riders had appeared, a flicker of hope appeared in Rhett's eyes. He looked at this woman, this quiet teacher who had drifted into his life on a breeze of dust and determination, and saw a strength he had never known. June became a general marshaling her forces. The parlor was no longer a schoolroom. It was a war room. First, she took a large piece of butcher paper and created a formal Blue Mesa Ranch schoolhouse schedule, detailing hours for reading, arithmetic, geography, and practical skills. She tacked it to the wall. Next, she started a logbook. In it, she recorded every meal they ate, noting the balance of corn, beans, meat, and the precious milk from their single cow. She listed chores, carefully assigning them by age. Ash was responsible for the wood pile, Wren for feeding the chickens, Tavo for keeping the water buckets full. She borrowed May Travers's household scale and a measuring tape. With a piece of charcoal, she created a growth chart on a smooth section of the adobe wall. She measured and weighed each child, her touch gentle but her purpose firm. She recorded the numbers in her logbook, a tangible record of their health. Then, she began to write. She composed a petition to the territorial judge of the 5th District, her handwriting a flawless, elegant script. It did not plead. It stated facts. It described the children's progress, their happiness, their integration into the community. She left space at the bottom for signatures. She wrote out to Dr. Calderon's small adobe clinic. The doctor listened to the story, her face growing darker with every word. She took the offered pen and paper and, in a sharp, angry hand, wrote a formal medical affidavit. It detailed her treatment of Wren's arm, praising the swift and competent first aid she had received. It attested to the general health, cleanliness, and good nourishment of all 4 children, concluding with the scathingly professional opinion that removing them from their current environment would be an act of medical and psychological negligence. The days ticked by, each one a turn of the screw. The children were quiet, watchful. The laughter had gone out of the ranch. Every time a rider appeared on the horizon, they would flinch. On the morning of the 8th day, a single horseman appeared. It was Deputy Silas Rudd. He was alone. The ranch held its breath. Rhett met him in the yard, his stance wary, his hands empty at his sides. "Callahan," Rudd said, dismounting. "Mrs. Fair sent me to conduct an inspection, to assess the children's living conditions before the transfer." It was a surprise attack, meant to catch them unprepared. "They're inside," Rhett said, his voice flat, and led the way. June had the children in the parlor. They were clean, their hair combed, their faces pale and serious. Wren was reading from the primer, her voice small and wavering. Deputy Rudd stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking profoundly uncomfortable. He was a man of the law, but he had eyes. He was not Prudence Fair. He saw not wards, but terrified children. He did his duty. He walked through the small house, inspecting the clean but spare bedrooms, the neatly swept floors. He looked in the kitchen, saw the pot of stew simmering on the stove for supper, the fresh-baked bread cooling on the counter. He returned to the parlor, his face unreadable. This was June's moment. "Deputy," she said, her voice calm. She did not stand. She gestured to the wall. "Perhaps you would like to see our school's schedule." He looked at it. "And here is our logbook of meals and activities," she said, pushing the open book across the table. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the neat columns. "And this," she said, her voice gaining a quiet power, "is our record of growth." She led him to the chart on the wall. He saw the charcoal marks, the names, the dates, the steady upward climb of inches and pounds. It was the simple, undeniable story of children who were thriving. Finally, she handed him the folded letter from Dr. Calderon. He read it, and then he read it again. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He looked at the children, who were watching him as if he were their executioner. He looked at Rhett, whose silent, protective presence filled the room. He looked at June, whose fierce, intelligent eyes did not waver. He folded the doctor's letter and handed it back to her. "Thank you for your time, Miss Mercer," he said, his voice quiet. And without another word, he turned and left. They watched him mount his horse and ride away, a solitary figure shrinking into the vastness of the landscape. The air in the parlor was thick with unspoken questions. Had they won? Had they lost? June looked at the calendar. 2 days left. They could only wait. The walls were built. Now they had to see if they would hold against the storm. The 9th day ended with a sky the color of a fresh bruise, yellow and purple and sick green. The air was not air at all. It was a weight, a heavy, wet blanket that smothered the landscape. There was no wind, only a dead, electric stillness. The children were quiet, moving about the house like small ghosts. The 10-day grace period would be over at sundown the next day. The wagon from Santa Fe was no longer a threat. It was an inevitability. The morning of the 10th day, the world broke open. It did not begin as rain. It began as a concussion. A single and violent clap of thunder so loud it rattled the ceramic pitcher on June's washstand. And with it, the sky fell. This was not the gentle, life-giving rain of the east. This was a high-desert deluge, a vertical flood, a furious, pounding assault of water that turned the dry, packed earth of the ranch yard into a slick, running sheet of mud within minutes. From the parlor window, June watched the Arroyo Verde, the dry, dusty creek bed that snaked through the property, a place where the children hunted for lizards. It was dry no more. A 4-foot wall of churning, brown water, thick as molasses and carrying rocks and uprooted trees, came roaring down the canyon. It hit the small wooden bridge that led to the high pastures, and the structure groaned, its pilings shuddering in the torrent. "The herd!" Rhett roared, his voice barely audible over the din. He was already pulling on his slicker, jamming his hat down on his head. "Ash, get your rope. We've got to move the herd to higher ground before they're cut off." "I'm coming!" Ash shouted, a desperate energy in his voice. He was alive with the crisis, eager to fight something he could actually see. "Rhett, it's too dangerous," June cried, following him to the door. "More dangerous to lose our stock," he yelled back. "It's all we have, June. You keep them inside." He pointed to the other children, his face grim. "Bar the door if you have to. Don't let them out." He and Ash ran into the blinding wall of water, heads down, already soaked to the skin. June stood at the window, her heart a cold stone in her chest, counting heads. Wren was beside her, tracing the path of the new, terrible river on the fogged glass. Tavo and Pippa were huddled by the cold fireplace, their eyes wide. The rain hammered the roof, a deafening drum roll that seemed to shake the very foundations of the adobe house. An hour passed, then another. The rain did not lessen. The arroyo was no longer a creek. It was a raging 30-yard-wide river, and it was still rising. Then, through the gray sheet of rain, she saw them. Rhett and Ash, struggling on the far side of the torrent. They had managed to push the main herd up the mesa, but they were pointing frantically at something caught in the middle of the arroyo. It was a small island, a crescent-shaped wedge of sandstone that was usually high and dry. Now, the brown water licked at its edges. Stranded on it were 3 yearling calves, bawling in terror, their thin legs trembling. "He's going to lose them," Wren whispered, her face pale. "That's the new bullstock." June watched in horror as Rhett checked the bridge. It was already submerged, the water rushing over the planks. It was impassable. Rhett turned and looked back at the house. He was trapped. The calves were trapped. June saw him slam his fist against his thigh, a rare gesture of pure, agonizing frustration. Then she saw Ash do something. He was arguing with Rhett. He pointed at the calves, then at himself. He uncoiled his lariat. "He's going to try and cross," June said, her blood running cold. "He's going to try and swim for them." Before she could think, she had thrown open the door. "Wren, watch Tavo and Pippa. Do not leave this porch." She ran, pulling her shawl over her head. But it was useless. The rain and wind tore at her, plastering her dress to her body in seconds. The mud sucked at her boots. She reached the bank of the arroyo just as Ash was tying his rope around his waist. "Ash, no!" she screamed over the roar of the water. "I can do it," he yelled back, his face a mask of stubborn, adolescent pride. This was his failure, his job. He was desperate to prove he was a man, to fix what the law was breaking. "I'm a strong swimmer." "It's not the water, it's the debris," Rhett bellowed, grabbing his son's shoulder. "There's logs in there, it'll take you under. I have to, Pa." "No," June's voice cut through the argument, sharp and absolute. She grabbed the rope from Ash's hands. "You'll never make it. The current's too fast, but the rope is a good idea." She looked around, her mind working with the same cold clarity it had found when Wren's arm was broken. "Rhett, get your lariat. Tie it to this one. We need the length." Rhett looked at her, his eyes questioning. "We can't swim it," she explained, shouting to be heard. "But we can wait it, if we have an anchor." She looked at Ash. "You are light, but you are strong. You will go. I will go with you. Rhett, you are the heaviest. You are our anchor. You stay on the bank. You hold the line. Whatever you do not let go." Rhett hesitated for only a second, then nodded, his trust in her absolute. He spliced the 2 ropes together with lightning fast, calloused fingers. June tied the other end around her own waist, then around Ash's, connecting them. "We go together," she told the boy. "You do exactly as I say. You test the ground before you put your weight down. Do you understand me?" Ash, his defiant anger replaced by focused adrenaline, nodded. Rhett. June yelled back to the bank. "Give us slack now! You follow her orders!" "Ash," Rhett roared, his voice a desperate prayer. "You hear me? Boy, only follow hers!" He braced himself, wrapping the rope around his waist and digging his heels into the muddy bank. June and Ash stepped into the torrent. The cold was a physical shock, a blow to the chest that stole her breath. The water was immediately at her waist, thick and powerful, pushing, pulling, trying to unbalance her. It was like fighting a living, malevolent beast. "Step now!" June yelled. She and Ash moved as one, a four-legged creature fighting the current. "It's too strong!" Ash cried, stumbling as a half-seen log rushed past, missing him by inches. "Look!" Wren was screaming from the porch, pointing frantically. Her mind, so attuned to the land, was reading the chaos. "The water, it's weaker by the big rock. The current is splitting. Go left, go left." June followed the girl's direction, pushing Ash toward the spot Wren had indicated. The water was, blessedly, a foot shallower. They found their footing. They fought their way, step by agonizing step, until their boots hit the sandstone of the crescent. They were on the island. The calves bawled, nudging them. "Tie them," June ordered. "Quickly." Ash's hands were numb, but he worked the rope, his fingers sure, creating a harness for the three small animals. And that was when the world tilted. Tavo, who had escaped Wren's watch, had run down to the bank, overcome by the need to be closer to the action. He was cheering, his small voice lost in the thunder. He ventured too close. The bank, already sodden and undermined, gave way. A section of mud and rock dissolved, and Tavo fell, disappearing into the brown, churning water with a small, terrified shriek. Rhett, his attention divided between the arroyo and the bank, saw it happen. For one terrible, split second, he was torn hold the rope for June and Ash, or save Tavo. He didn't make a choice. He just reacted. He let go of the rope. "No!" June screamed, feeling the line go slack. She staggered as the current, no longer held in check by the anchor, slammed into her. Rhett had already dived into the water. He was a powerful swimmer, and he lunged through the torrent, his arms churning. He surfaced, Tavo's small, sputtering form clutched in one arm. He had the boy. But now, they were in the main channel, being swept downstream toward the wreckage of the bridge. "Rhett!" June screamed, her voice cracking with terror. And on the ridge, overlooking the entire chaotic scene, two riders appeared. They sat on their horses, silhouetted against the gray sky, motionless. It was Deputy Silas Rudd and Prudence Fair. They had arrived on the 10th day, not in a wagon, but on horseback, to execute the order and take the children. They arrived just in time to see Rhett Callahan, his arm locked around a sputtering Tavo, being swept toward his death. They saw Ash and June, stranded on a shrinking island, holding three terrified calves. They saw Wren on the porch, holding Pippa, screaming into the storm. They were not witnessing a dysfunctional, illegitimate household. They were witnessing a family fighting a war with nature. And losing? June scrambled back, pushing Ash. "Hold the calves! Don't move!" She unwound the rope from her own waist, her fingers clumsy, her body shaking so hard she could barely think. She ran to the downstream edge of the small island. Rhett and Tavo were seconds away from being smashed against the bridge pilings. She had one chance. She coiled the wet, heavy rope and threw it with all the strength in her body. The loop unfurled, landing just short. Again, Ash was beside her, his face white. "Throw again." She pulled it back, the rope burning her hands. Rhett saw her. He kicked, trying to angle toward her, holding Tavo's head above the water. June threw again. The loop sailed, landing perfectly over Rhett's head and shoulders. He got an arm through it and yanked it tight, just as his feet hit the debris pile at the bridge. "Pull!" he roared. June and Ash dug their heels into the sandstone. They were too small, light people against a man, a child, and the full, murderous force of the Arroyo Verde. The rope went taut as a guitar string. June felt her feet sliding, the rocks slick with mud. They weren't strong enough. "We can't hold him," Ash screamed, his face a mask of terror. They were being pulled, inch by inch, toward the edge of the island. Prudence and Silas sat frozen on the ridge. This was it. This was the tragedy, the final, avoidable proof of an unstable environment. But Silas Rudd was a lawman, and he was a man of the West. He spurred his horse. "Mrs. Fair, stay here." He charged his horse down the slick hillside, plunging into the shallower, calmer edge of the flood. He was too far away to help June, but he was downstream. He pulled his lariat from his saddle, but he didn't need to. Wren, seeing June and Ash failing, had acted. She had run from the porch, grabbing the long, heavy logging chain that lay near the woodpile. She was dragging it, stumbling, falling, toward the bank. "Here, the chain!" she screamed. Her action broke the spell. Silas saw her plan. He rode to her, leaped from his saddle, grabbed the chain, and plunged into the water. Bracing himself against the main support of the house porch, he threw the heavy chain with a grunt. It landed on the bank, 5 feet from June. It was too short, but Rhett, seeing the chain, understood. He let go of the bridge piling, clinging to June's rope, and kicked, allowing the current to swing him closer to the bank. June and Ash fell, dragged by his weight, but June grabbed the end of the chain. She wrapped her rope around it, creating a new, solid anchor. "Pull!" she shrieked. "Pull!" Silas, on the bank, grabbed the chain and pulled. June and Ash, still on the island, pulled. Rhett, in the water, kicked together. They dragged him and Tavo out of the main current and into the relative safety of the flooded bank. June, her strength gone, collapsed onto her knees in the mud, her arms still locked around the rope. Rhett crawled onto the bank, coughing and spitting, and pushed Tavo into June's arms. She grabbed the boy, pulling him to her chest, her body shaking in violent, uncontrollable spasms. Silas Rudd stood over them, his slicker dripping, his face grim. Prudence Fair slowly, carefully, rode her horse down the hill. She stared at the scene, the shivering children, the half-drowned man, the woman covered in mud, all of them connected by a web of ropes and chains. She looked at the 3 calves, still stranded. She looked at the destroyed bridge. This was not a home. It was a disaster. An hour later, the rain had subsided to a drizzle. The ranch house was a small, warm haven in a world of mud. A fire roared in the parlor, the first one June had ever lit there. Rhett, Ash, and Tavo were stripped of their wet clothes, wrapped in every dry blanket in the house. June, herself shivering in a dry dress, was pressing her ear to Tavo's small, cold chest. Just as Dr. Calderon had taught her. "Breathe deep," she murmured. "Again." She listened, her eyes closed, listening for the telltale rattle of water in his lungs. The door opened. Dr. Inez Calderon entered, her black bag in her hand. Behind her stood Silas Rudd, his hat in his hand. He had ridden to fetch her. "I heard there was a swimming party." "Doctor," Calderon said, her voice dry. She got to work. She examined Tavo first, her movements efficient. She listened to his chest, thumped his back. "He's fine, cold, scared, but his lungs are clear." She moved to Ash, then to Rhett. "You were all lucky. This one." She pointed a sharp finger at June. "Has a good head on her shoulders." She checked their breathing. She knew what to look for. She looked at Silas Rudd. "You came to see if these children were neglected. Deputy, you found your answer. They are looked after better than any child in your town. They are a team, and they are alive because all of them, from the girl who read the river to the woman who threw the rope, knew what to do. You cannot manufacture that in a foundling home." Prudence Fair had remained on the porch, her boots muddy, her face a mask. She had seen everything. She had seen a family function not just as a unit, but as a trained rescue team. Silas Rudd stepped forward. He looked at Rhett, who was holding a trembling Tavo on his lap. He looked at June, who was rubbing Ash's cold hands between her own. "Mr. Callahan," Silas said, his voice quiet, all the official bluster gone. The conditions, the bridge is out, the roads will be impassable for days. So, you're stuck here? Rhett asked, his voice hoarse. No, sir, Silas said. He looked at Prudence, then back at Rhett. I mean, the paperwork, for the transfer, it's incomplete. I find I must review Dr. Calderon's initial testimony again, in light of today. Prudence Fair's mouth tightened into a thin, white line, but she said nothing. Silas Rudd cleared his throat. I expect it will take me at least 3 days to properly assess the new information. The deadline is suspended pending my review. Good day, ma'am, Doctor. He tipped his hat to June and walked out the door. Prudence Fair gave one last, long, unreadable look at the scene, the fire, the blankets, the children safe in the arms of the man and woman, and followed him. That night, the storm had passed. The air was cold and impossibly clean. The entire world smelled of wet earth and pinon, the scent of a second chance. The children were asleep, a pile of exhausted limbs in their shared bed. June and Rhett sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm, golden circle. They were both too tired to speak, their bodies aching. Rhett pushed a piece of paper across the table. It was the petition June had written to the judge, but he had added something at the bottom, in his own rough, strong handwriting. It was a formal application to the territorial court, requesting that June Mercer be named full co-guardian of all 4 children, citing her steadfast care, medical competence, and unwavering devotion in the face of mortal peril. Sign it, June, Rhett said, his voice quiet. It's the last piece. With this, they can't say no. It makes us a single unit, in the eyes of the law. It was a proposal, she realized, not of marriage, but of something far more profound. A proposal of family, a legal binding. It was the easy way, the smart play. It would check all of Mrs. Fair's boxes. It would seal their victory. June picked up the pen. She looked at his name and the blank line he had left for hers. Then she set the pen down. She pushed the paper gently back to him. No, she said, her voice soft but unbreakable. Rhett stared at her, his face a mask of confusion. June, why, this is how we win. We will win, she said, meeting his eyes. But we will win on the truth we already built. We will win because they are your children, and because I am their teacher. We will win because what we are doing is right. I will not win this by a legal trick. I will not have them say I only did it to secure a claim. She put her hand over his on the table, the first time she had ever initiated the touch. Don't sell the roof before we build the walls, she whispered, echoing her own words back to him. Our case is strong enough. I will not be a co-guardian on paper until a judge says we have won, free and clear. We win this on our own terms, not theirs. Rhett looked at her, at the quiet, unshakable integrity in her eyes. He slowly, finally, understood. He turned his hand over, his calloused fingers lacing with hers. He did not need a piece of paper to tell him what he already knew. His family was right here. The rain had withdrawn, leaving the world scoured and glistening under a sky of brilliant, cold stars. The air, washed clean of dust, was thin and sharp with the scent of wet sage and the deep, resinous perfume of the pinon pines. A profound quiet had fallen over the Blue Mesa Ranch, the exhausted silence that follows a battle fought and, for the moment, won. The roar of the arroyo had subsided to a steady, powerful murmur, a constant reminder of the fury that had passed. Inside the adobe house, a fire crackled in the parlor hearth, the first fire of the season. It pushed back the damp chill that had seeped into the walls, casting a warm, flickering light that made the familiar room seem like a sanctuary. The children, worn out by terror and relief, were deep in an exhausted, huddled sleep, their breathing the only other sound in the house. June moved about the kitchen, her body a single, deep ache. She had found a small patch of mint growing wild by the well house. and she crushed the leaves between her fingers, dropping them into a tin pot of water to heat on the stove. The simple, clean scent was a balm to her frayed nerves. She was wearing her last dry dress, a simple calico, and her hair was still damp, hanging loose down her back. She heard a floorboard creak behind her. It was Rhett. He stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the parlor, a dark, quiet shape against the firelight. He had a heavy gray wool cloak draped over his arm, one that she had seen stored in a chest but never used. He didn't speak, just stood there, watching her. There was a hesitation in his stillness, an uncertainty she had never seen in him before, not even in the depths of his fear for Wren. The crisis had stripped away his layers of stoic competence, leaving something more vulnerable exposed. "I'm making mint tea," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "To warm the bones." He nodded, taking a step into the kitchen. "Good idea." He held up the cloak. "I thought you might be cold. Your shawl was lost in the flood." He didn't bring it to her. He held it out, an offering. She dried her hands on her apron and walked to him, taking the heavy wool. It was soft and smelled of cedar from the chest. "Thank you," she whispered. They stood for a moment in the small space, caught in the quiet orbit of the lamp. The day's events hung between them, a massive, unspoken thing. They had faced down the law and the fury of nature, side by side. They had functioned as one unit, two halves of a whole, and the knowledge of it had changed the very air they breathed. "Come by the fire," he said, his voice a low rumble. She followed him into the parlor. He took the cloak from her and draped it around her shoulders as she sat on the long wooden bench he'd built near the hearth. He then sat at the other end, leaving a respectable distance between them, and stared into the flames. June pulled the warm, heavy wool around her, the simple comfort of it a profound relief. The firelight danced across the planes of his face, carving shadows under his high cheekbones and in the tired lines around his eyes. He looked older tonight, but also younger, the hard shell of the self-reliant rancher worn thin. The snap and hiss of the burning piñon logs were the only sounds, each crackle a punctuation mark in their long, shared silence. She had expected him to talk about the deputy, about their 3-day reprieve, about strategy, but he didn't. He was somewhere else entirely, lost in the fiery heart of the blaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean forward to hear it. "Sometimes," he began, his gaze fixed on the fire, "I wake up in the middle of the night, and I forget they're here for just a second, and the house is just quiet, the way it was before." He paused, swallowing. "And then I get scared, not because of the quiet, but because the quiet might come back for good." He turned his head then and looked at her, his eyes dark with a raw, unguarded honesty. "That woman, Mrs. Fair, she looks at me and she sees a temporary man, a man playing house. She thinks I'm not fit because there's no blood between us. And the worst part is, sometimes I think she's right." He was confessing a fear deeper than any law, more terrifying than any flood. The fear that he was an imposter, that his love, as vast and powerful as it was not enough to make him a father in the eyes of the world. That one day his makeshift family would be exposed as a fraud and swept away, leaving him alone in the silence again. June's heart ached for him. She understood that fear. It was the other side of the same, lonely coin she had carried for years. "I know that fear," she said softly. He looked at her, his brows furrowed in confusion. She took a breath and spoke the truth that had been the defining wound of her life. She did not say it as a fact, as she had on her first day, but as a shared vulnerability, a piece of her broken self offered in return for his. "When the doctor in Boston told me I could never bear children," she said, her voice steady but trembling with the memory. "He said it as if he were closing a book, the final chapter. And in that moment, I ceased to be a whole woman in the eyes of the world. My purpose was gone. Every time I saw a mother with her child, every time I heard a baby cry, it was a reminder of the part of me that was barren, empty." She looked down at her hands, resting in her lap. "So I came out here. I thought, if I can't be a mother, I can be a teacher. It's a useful, respectable thing. But it's a role, a part to play. And every day I am here, I feel like an imposter. Rhett, I love these children with everything in me. But I hear Mrs. Fair's voice in my head too. You are not their mother. It is a ghost that follows me." The silence that fell between them now was different. It was not an empty space, but a shared one, filled with the weight of their twin confessions. He, the man who feared he wasn't a real father. She, the woman who grieved she could never be a real mother. And in the middle, 4 sleeping children who cared for none of these things, who only knew the safety of his arms and the comfort of her voice. He didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, as if it took all the concentration he possessed, he lifted his hand. It was the hand she had bandaged, the linen starkly white against his sun-darkened skin. His fingers were scarred, his knuckles thick, the nails blunt and clean. It was a hand that knew only work, a hand that could build and mend and fight. He didn't reach for her. He offered. He extended his hand and opened it, palm up, in the space between them. It was an invitation, a question asked without a single word. It was an act of pure, terrifying trust. June looked at his open hand. She saw the story of his life in the lines of his palm, the calluses that spoke of hardship, the strength that held his family together. She lifted her own hand, pale and smooth, a teacher's hand, and she placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, engulfing them. His skin was rough, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. A warmth began to build between them, a slow, deep heat that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a current of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the shared space they now occupied. It was the simple, profound comfort of not being alone in the dark. They sat that way for a long time, hand in hand, watching the flames dance and die down to glowing embers. Finally, he stood, gently pulling her to her feet. He didn't let go of her hand. They stood facing each other in the warm, dim light, so close that the wool of the cloak he'd given her brushed against his chest. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him. His breath was warm, smelling faintly of wood smoke. Her own breath caught in her throat, tasting of mint. She saw the firelight reflected in the deep, calm pools of his eyes, and she saw something else there too, something that made her own eyes well up with tears. It was not sadness, not pity. It was acceptance. It was the look of a man who saw all of her, the capable teacher, the barren woman, the fierce protector, the frightened imposter, and did not turn away. It was the staggering, breathtaking relief of being truly seen. He lifted his free hand, not to her face, but to a stray strand of her damp hair, tucking it gently behind her ear. His fingers brushed the shell of her ear, and a shiver traced its way down her spine. He lowered his head. The movement was slow, deliberate, giving her every opportunity to turn away. She did not move. She rose on her toes, a small, answering motion. The kiss was as gentle as the rain that had finally ended. It was not a kiss of hungry passion, not a desperate claiming. It was a kiss of quiet confirmation. His lips were chapped from the wind, but soft. It was a slow, deep, searching kiss that asked for nothing and promised everything. It tasted of smoke and mint and the clean, cold night air. It was a promise of shelter after the storm, a quiet statement in the dark we belong here, together. When he lifted his head, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against the warm, solid column of his neck, just below his jaw. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed. She could feel a slight tremor run through his powerful shoulders. The quiet, shuddering release of a man who had stood alone against the world for too long. She breathed in his scent, the honest smell of leather from his saddle, the faint tang of iron from the forge, the warmth of wood smoke, and underneath it all, a rare and profound sense of peace, of home. He brought his other arm around her, pulling her gently closer. He adjusted the heavy wool cloak, wrapping it more securely around her shoulders. a gesture of pure, protective care. His hand came to rest on the small of her back, a warm, steady pressure that was not possessive, but supportive. It anchored her. Outside, the last of the wind sighed through the pines and then fell silent. The world was still. "June," he whispered, his voice a rough velvet against her hair. "Rhett," she answered, her voice muffled against his skin. "In the morning," he said, the words a solemn vow. "We'll still be here." "Yes," she whispered back. "We'll still be here." The fire had burned down to a bed of winking, orange coals. The room was growing colder. He led her back to the long bench, and they sat down, this time with no space between them. He kept his arm around her, and she leaned her head on his shoulder, the rough cotton of his shirt soft against her cheek. Their free hands found each other, their fingers lacing together naturally, as if they had done so 1,000 times before. They didn't speak again. There were no more words needed. The night wrapped them in its quiet, protective darkness. Two solitary people who had finally, against all odds, found their harbor. The first hint of dawn was a pale, pearlescent gray in the window when June finally stirred. She had slept there, on his shoulder, a deeper and more peaceful sleep than she had known in a decade. He was awake, his gaze on the sleeping children, his expression soft in the dim light. She sat up, and he let his arm fall away. Though his hand still held hers, she took the gray wool cloak from her shoulders and began to fold it, her movements neat and deliberate. He watched her, a small, tired smile touching his lips. She finished folding it and placed it on the bench beside her. She looked at him, and her own smile answered his. There was no shyness in her gaze, no uncertainty. In her eyes was the quiet, steady light of a woman who had weighed her life, faced her ghosts, and made her choice. She was home. The 3-day reprieve, born of chaos and courage, felt less like a victory and more like a ceasefire, a temporary halt in a war that had now shifted from the battlefield of the Arroyo to a bloodless conflict of paper and ink. The ranch was busy. Rhett and Ash, with 2 hands hired from May Travers's spread, were already working on a new, stronger bridge. The ground was drying, the air was crisp, and the Blue Mesa Ranch was under a microscope. On the 4th morning, they returned, Silas Rudd and Prudence Fair. This time, there was no pretense of a surprise inspection. This was a formal visitation. Silas looked as if he hadn't slept, his eyes shadowed with a conflict he could no longer ignore. Prudence Fair was a different woman. The shock of the flood had passed, and in its place was a cold, bureaucratic resolve. She had seen a family, yes, but she had also seen chaos, danger, and a near tragedy. Her belief in her righteousness had been, if anything, strengthened. "Mr. Callahan," she announced, standing on the porch that had been their sanctuary. "Deputy Rudd has, generously, suspended the removal order pending a formal review. However, this is not a pardon. It is a probationary period. During this time, this household will be held to the explicit standards of the Territorial Benevolence Committee." She unrolled a document, a list of demands. "The ad hoc schooling I witnessed is insufficient," she declared. "I expect a standardized curriculum, a daily schedule, and measurable progress. Furthermore, I require a documented nutritional regimen. These children must have balanced, consistent meals, not just stew when you hunt it." She was turning their self-sufficiency into a liability. "And finally, I expect a documented ledger of work. The committee is highly sensitive to the exploitation of ward labor." She was, June realized, attempting to bury them in the very paperwork June had tried to use against her. She was setting a trap. She expected a frontier rancher and a half-broke schoolteacher to fail at the one thing she truly understood: bureaucracy. Rhett looked at the list, his expression darkening. This was a language he did not speak. He was about to tell her where she could put her documents when June stepped forward, a strange, calm light in her eyes. "We welcome the oversight, Mrs. Fair, June said, her voice clear and bright. We believe you will be impressed with our standards. Prudence's eyes narrowed. This was not the reaction she expected. The moment their horses were out of sight, June began her counteroffensive. The parlor became her command center. Rhett, I need lumber, smooth pine, if you have it, she said. And paint. If there's no paint, I need soot and linseed oil. June, what for? She wants a standardized school, June said, a fierce smile playing on her lips. We will give her a school that would make a Boston headmaster proud. For the next 2 days, June was a general. She took the crude, homemade blackboard and, with Rhett's help, framed it properly. She used her own meticulous hand to paint permanent lines on it for penmanship practice. She took a fresh sheet of paper and created a daily timetable, her script a flawless, elegant copperplate. 8:00 a.m. morning duties wood. Water, eggs, breakfast. 9:00 a.m. arithmetic slate practice. 10:00 a.m. reading geography. 11:00 a.m. penmanship recitation. 12:00 p.m. midday meal. She created a formal gradebook, marking down Ash's surprising aptitude for fractions and Wren's elegant, precise handwriting. Then, she tackled nutrition. She created a weekly menu and tacked it to the kitchen wall. She framed their simple, hearty diet in the language of bureaucratic genius. Monday cornmeal mush W/molasses carbohydrate energy. Fresh milk calcium growth. Stewed apples vitamins. Tuesday pinto beans, salt pork protein stamina. Cornbread grain. Wednesday scrambled farm eggs protein. Potato hash stamina. It was the food they had always eaten, but now it was documented. It was a shield. The community, having heard the story of the flood and the subsequent legal threat, began to move. May Travers was the first. Her wagon rattled into the yard, loaded not just with sympathy, but with supplies. Heard you're being graded like a prize heifer, May said, her arms full. She deposited a heavy, lye-scented box on the porch. Soap. A house with children needs soap. Prudence Fair looks like a woman who judges a soul by its laundry. She also brought 3 new slates, a box of chalk sticks, and a small, precious bottle of ink. The community is meeting this Sunday. Reverend Pike's idea? Reverend Pike had taken the petition June had drafted and made it his own. He declared the coming Sunday a community day of service at the Blue Mesa Ranch. The stated purpose was to help Rhett and his neighbors finish the new bridge. The true purpose was to sign their names. They came, not in a trickle, but in a flood of their own. More than 20 families from Juniper Bend and the surrounding spreads. The yard filled with wagons and the smell of roasting coffee. The men, a silent, capable army in denim and canvas, fell in with Rhett, their hammers ringing out in a steady, defiant rhythm as the new bridge took shape. The women, led by May, spread a feast on blankets in the yard and on a small table on the porch. Reverend Pike laid out June's petition and Dr. Calderon's affidavit. One by one, they came up, men who could barely write their own names, their hands calloused and thick, gripped the pen and drew their mark. Women, their faces weathered by the same sun as May's, signed with a grim, steady hand. It was not a request for mercy. It was a statement of fact, a chorus of witnesses. In the middle of this gathering, Silas Rudd and Prudence Fair rode up for their scheduled inspection. Prudence's face tightened in fury. She was witnessing a public, organized defiance. "Mrs. Fair, Deputy," June said, her voice welcoming, as if greeting friends at a party. "You've come to see our progress." She led them into the parlor, now a pristine, orderly schoolroom. She pointed to the new timetable, the weekly menu. She presented her gradebook. Prudence scanned the pages, her lips a thin, white line, searching for a single flaw. "This is all very neat," Prudence conceded. "But what of the labor deputy Rudd? I want to inspect the chores log." Silas, his face unreadable, stepped forward. "Ma'am, the log mentions the boy. Ash is tasked with cattle management." "As I suspected," Prudence said. "A full day's work, no doubt." "No, ma'am," a voice said. Ash stepped forward. He was clean, his hair combed, and he was holding a rolled-up piece of paper. He had lost his nervous hat-twisting habit. "I'm not a laborer. I'm in charge of the new pen design." He unrolled the paper on the table. It was a brilliant, meticulous drawing, a top-down schematic of a new, modular cattle pen, with gates and chutes. "See," Ash explained, his finger tracing the lines he'd drawn. Pa and I saw a picture of a Chicago stockyard in the geography book, but their design was for flat land. It wouldn't work here because of the arroyo. He pointed to his own modifications. "I designed these angled gates so we can move the herd to high ground in less than 10 minutes. It's a modular system." Silas Rudd stared at the drawing, genuinely impressed. This was not the scrawl of a child. It was the work of an apprentice engineer. "And what is this?" Prudence asked, turning to Wren, who was standing by her own small desk. Wren held up a sheet of paper that had been oiled to make it translucent and waterproof. It was a map. "It's our flood safety map, ma'am," Wren said, her voice small but clear. "I drew it after the storm." She laid it on the table. "This is the ranch house. This is the arroyo. The red X's is where the bank collapsed. I mapped the weak points. This yellow line is the new, safe path to the high pasture, the one that doesn't cross the wash. And this," she pointed to a diagram of the house, "is the escape route from every room to the muster point on the hill." Prudence Fair was speechless. She had come to find neglected wards. She had found a foreman and a cartographer. "Ahem." A loud, dry cough came from the doorway. "Doctor." Inez Calderon stood there, her black bag in hand, her eyes missing nothing. "I'm not interrupting. I'm contributing. I have my formal, notarized report for the committee." She handed the papers directly to Silas Rudd. "A summary for your benefit. Mrs. Fair," the doctor said, her sharp eyes boring into the woman. "The children's health remains excellent, their weights and heights." She nodded toward June's chart. "Are progressing at an admirable rate. But more importantly, I have conducted interviews with each child. Their psychological attachment to Mr. Callahan and Miss Mercer is profound. They exhibit a high degree of resilience, a sense of security, and advanced problem-solving skills. As you have just witnessed, in my professional opinion, to remove them from this environment would be an act of clinical, catastrophic trauma." Prudence snatched the report from Silas's hand. She scanned it, her face pale with rage. She had been outmaneuvered at every turn. "This is all sentiment," she snapped. This circus." She waved her hand at the community outside. "These are not facts. The fact is, they are orphans. The fact is, he is not their father. The law is the law." "Then let us turn to the law," June said, her voice cutting through the sudden, tense silence. Prudence turned, her eyes blazing. "You are correct, Mrs. Fair," June said. "Your committee is clearly compromised in its assessment. So we will no longer appeal to it." She turned her gaze to Silas Rudd. "Deputy, as a citizen of this territory, I am formally petitioning for a full, open hearing before the circuit judge in Sable Mesa. We will present this evidence, our school, our progress, the doctor's testimony, and this petition from the community to a judge, and let him rule on what is truly in the best interest of the child." It was a brilliant checkmate. Prudence could not refuse a judicial review without admitting her case was weak. Silas Rudd, a man of the law above all, was trapped. He looked at June's steady, expectant face. He looked at Prudence, who was vibrating with suppressed fury. He looked at the petition on the table, bearing the names of half the county. "A citizen has a right to petition the court," Silas said, his voice slow and careful. I will file the request with Judge Hemlock. The hearing will likely be soon. He is in Sable Mesa this week." That night, the ranch was quiet again. The community was gone. The bridge was finished, but the fight had just moved to a new, more dangerous arena. Rhett paced the parlor floor. June, a judge in a courtroom. That's her world, not ours. He'll be a man just like her. All books and no sense. We can't risk this. We can't. He stopped, his face wrought with a fear she had never seen. Not during the flood, not when Wren was hurt. This was the cold terror of the law. There's another way, he said, his voice rough. A better way, one that seals it, once and for all. He took her hands. They were cold. Marry me, June, he whispered. We'll ride to Sable Mesa tomorrow. We'll find the Reverend. If we are married, you are legally my wife. You are the mother of this household. They have no case. Their entire argument, the unlegitimized guardianship, it evaporates. We win. It was the easy, safe, logical path. It was the thing her heart leaped for. To be his wife. To be, in the eyes of the world, a mother. She looked up at him, her heart aching. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the deep, abiding love, and the terrifying fear of loss that drove him. She raised her hand, not to his, but to his face, her palm resting against his rough cheek. Rhett, she said, her voice so soft it was almost a breath. If you ask me to marry you in a month, or a year, my answer will be yes. I will say yes because I love you, and because this is my home. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. But I will not marry you tomorrow, she continued, her voice gaining a strength that came from a place of unshakable integrity. I will not marry you to win a court case. I will not marry you out of fear. We have built this entire defense on the truth. We've shown them we are a family, in fact. We will win because we are right. Rhett, not because we found a last-minute legal dodge. We must win on our own terms. She looked him square in the eye. Trust me. Trust our case. Trust what we've built. We win this as we are, or we don't win at all. He searched her face, seeing no doubt, no fear, only a clear, pure certainty. His own fear receded, replaced by a profound, humbling awe. He had asked a teacher to stay. He had found a warrior. He nodded, covering her hand with his. I trust you. June. The next 3 days were a blur. The hearing was set. Reverend Pike arrived, not as a man of God, but as a strategist. He drilled them, turning the parlor into a mock courtroom. Rhett, Mrs. Fair's lawyer will call you a drifter, he said. He will say you collected these children as cheap labor. You must not get angry. You must look the judge in the eye. You must speak short, true sentences. I found them. I could not leave them. They are my family. June, the Reverend said. He will paint you as a barren, meddling spinster. He will call you a transient. You must be the rock. I am their teacher. I am their caregiver. I am here. June gathered her exhibits. The logbook, the weekly menu, the petition, now bearing 67 signatures, Dr. Calderon's report, Ash's technical drawing, Wren's flood map, and last, she found a new drawing Wren had tucked into her primer. It wasn't a map. It was a simple crayon and chalk drawing of the ranch house under a bright yellow sun. In front, 6 figures stood in a line, all of them holding hands, a tall man, a woman, a lanky boy, a small girl, a smaller boy, and a tiny girl clutching a doll. Underneath, in Wren's careful, newly learned letters, she had spelled out a single word, Family. This, June thought, was their final testimony. A wire arrived in Sable Mesa. May Travers, picking up supplies, saw Prudence Fair herself leaving the telegraph office, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. A knot of dread formed in May's stomach. She sent her son to ride to the ranch. June, May said, her face pale as she stood on the porch. She was sending a wire. To Santa Fe, to the Saguaro Foundling Home. The blood drained from June's face. She understood. Prudence Fair was not waiting for the judge's verdict. She was so confident of winning that she had already ordered the transport wagon. She expected to walk out of that courtroom and take the children immediately. The hearing was not a review. It was an execution. The race against time had just become a sprint to the finish line. The night before the hearing was suffocating. A different kind of stillness had fallen, not the calm of the post-storm, but the tense, held breath of a man awaiting a verdict. Every shadow seemed longer. Every night sound the hoot of an owl, the scurry of a pack rat magnified. In the parlor, the 6 of them were gathered. June was not teaching. She was reviewing. Ash, what will you say? Reverend Pike had drilled them. I'll show him my drawing. I'll tell him I'm the foreman, Ash said, his voice trying for a bravado it didn't quite possess. Wren, I'll show him my map. I'll tell him I keep us safe. Tavo, I fell in the water, Tavo whispered, his face crumpling. No, son, Rhett said, kneeling and putting his big hands on the boy's shoulders. You tell them you were saved. You tell them we pull each other out. That's the most important part. June tucked Pippa into bed, the child clutching her rag doll. The whole family was on edge, a collection of exposed nerves. Rhett was checking the latches on the doors, pacing the perimeter. June was packing her satchel with the exhibits, the logs, the maps, the petition as if preparing for a final, desperate battle. Go to bed. June, Rhett said, his voice rough with exhaustion. You need your strength for tomorrow. She nodded, but neither of them believed sleep would come. She lay down in her small room, fully clothed, listening to the house settle. She heard Rhett finally sit in his chair in the parlor, the creak of the wood a signal that he was taking the first watch. Sleep did come, but it was a thin, fitful thing. She was adrift in a sea of anxiety, her dreams filled with gavels and the cold, judgmental eyes of Prudence Fair. She was ripped from it by a sound that did not belong to a dream. Clang, 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 clang. It was the heavy Iron Ranch bell, the one reserved for a dire emergency, fire or attack. June was out of bed in an instant, her heart leaping into her throat. The air in her room was thick, not just with sleep, but with the acrid, stinging smell of smoke. She tore her door open. The parlor was hazy, the smell of burning hay and pine thick and choking. Through the window, she saw it, the large barn. The one Rhett and Ash had just repaired was a roaring inferno. Orange, hungry flames licked at the night sky, devouring the roof. Ash was at the bell, yanking the rope, his small, silhouetted form a frantic pendulum. The children, Rhett bellowed, his voice a roar of pure panic. He was already out the front door, not running from the fire, but toward it. The bulls, they're in there. He grabbed a bucket, a useless gesture against the blaze, and disappeared into the billowing black smoke at the barn's entrance. Wren, Tavo, Pippa, June screamed, running to their room. The children were awake. Tavo and Wren huddled together, crying in terror. Out, out now, June yelled, her voice a sharp, non-negotiable command. She grabbed Tavo's hand. Wren, take Pippa. Wren, her face pale but her eyes wide with adrenaline, grabbed her little sister's arm. Pippa, come. The map, June shouted, remembering. Wren, the map, our escape route. It's in my head, Wren cried. The muster point by the creek. Go, June ordered, pushing them toward the back door, away from the heat and the smoke. Follow Wren. Do not stop for anything. Go. She herded them out into the cold night air. The roar of the fire a physical blow to their ears. The night was lit as bright as day. A terrifying, dancing orange light. Wren, lead them, I'm right behind you, June said. She pushed the children forward, their small, white nightgowns ghostly against the dark. Wren, a true leader, grabbed Tavo's hand and began to run toward the dry part of the creek bed, the spot they had designated as their muster point. June turned for one last check. Pippa, Pippa. The smallest child was gone. She wasn't with Wren and Tavo, who were now 50 yards away. Looking back, she wasn't on the porch. Pippa, June screamed, her voice cracking with a terror that dwarfed everything she had felt during the flood. A small whimper. To her left, Pippa, in her panic, hadn't followed the group. She had run toward what was familiar. She had run toward the barn, toward her pa. Terrified by the smoke and the shouting, she had done what small, frightened creatures do. She had hidden. She was wedged in the small, dark space under the hay manger, a dry, tinder-filled structure just a few yards from the main barn wall. Embers, carried on the superheated wind, were already landing on it. "Rhett!" June shrieked, but he was lost inside the inferno. His form swallowed by the smoke. There was no one else. There was no time. June didn't think. She acted. She dropped to her hands and knees, keeping her face low to the ground where the air was clearer. The heat was a solid wall, blistering her skin. "Pippa, I'm coming, crawl to me!" She army crawled under the thick, choking smoke, the ground hot beneath her palms. She plunged into the darkness under the manger. It was hotter here, the air thick with hay dust and the smell of old leather. She saw two wide, terrified eyes, shining in the firelight. Pippa was frozen, her small body wedged against the back wall, her doll clutched to her chest. "I have you," June gasped, the smoke searing her lungs. She grabbed the child's small, rigid body. Pippa screamed, clinging to the wooden post. "Let go! Baby, let go!" June yanked, pulling the child free. At that exact moment, a section of the barn roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and flaming debris. A heavy burning beam crashed onto the manger, just feet from where they were. The entire structure groaned. June didn't wait. She shielded Pippa's body with her own and scrambled backward, dragging the child through the dirt and gravel, out into the open air. She was choking, her eyes streaming. A wave of heat washed over them as the hay in the manger caught, the whole thing erupting in a whoosh of flame. June felt a searing, sharp pain across her left shoulder as a cascade of embers rained down, igniting the shoulder of her dress. She rolled, smothering the flame with her own body, never letting go of Pippa. She got to her feet, her legs shaking. Pippa clutched to her chest. She ran, stumbling, toward the creek. She had just reached Wren and Tavo, who were sobbing with relief, when she saw two horsemen on the ridge. It was them, Silas Rudd and Prudence Fair. June's heart stopped. They had come. In the middle of the night, they had come to take the children, and they had arrived to find the ranch in flames, the children in their nightgowns, and her, June, covered in soot and singed. This was it. This was the end. They had lost. "They're here to watch us burn," she whispered, her voice a dead, hollow thing. But Silas Rudd was not watching. He was riding. He spurred his horse, not toward June, but toward the inferno. He had been camping just over the ridge, his conscience a burning coal in his own chest. The hearing was in the morning, and he couldn't sleep. He was wrestling with his duty versus what he had seen. When he heard the alarm bell, his first thought wasn't of the law. It was of the children. He leaped from his horse before it even stopped, tearing his canteen from his saddle. He ran toward Rhett, who had just staggered out of the barn, coughing, his face black with soot. "The bulls are out," Rhett gasped. "Got him out the back, but the fire!" "Where are the rustlers?" Silas yelled, pulling his own slicker from his saddle and using it to beat at the flames that were now licking at the side of the main house. "Rustlers!" Rhett choked, his eyes wide. "This ain't accidental. Callahan!" Silas shouted over the roar. "I saw two men ride out as I came in. They set this fire!" Even as he spoke, a third man, his face masked by a bandana, burst from the smoke, running from the tack room. He hadn't expected a deputy. He ran straight into Silas Rudd. Silas, a lawman to his bones, didn't hesitate. He dropped the slicker and tackled the man, both of them rolling in the mud and ash. It was a short, brutal fight. Silas ended it with a practiced, heavy blow. He had the man's arms tied behind his back with a length of rope from the man's own belt before Rhett had even caught his breath. "Get a bucket," Silas ordered Rhett. "Save the house." And then Prudence Fair watched the miracle happen. From the darkness, figures appeared. May Travers, in her nightgown and boots, carrying two buckets. Her husband, Tom, right behind her. Then Reverend Pike and the Hendersons and the Cotters. The entire community, woken by the bell and the glow in the sky, was arriving. They did not stand and gawk. They did not ask questions. They formed a line, a human chain, from the horse trough to the house. May, June, Rhett, Silas, the Reverend, Tom, and a dozen others. They passed buckets of water, a steady, rhythmic, desperate dance. Full buckets flew toward the house. Empty buckets flew back to the trough. They were a single organism, a machine built of loyalty and grit. Prudence Fair sat alone on her horse, a solitary, stunned spectator. She was watching the very thing she had tried to dismantle. She was watching a community's true bond in action. She was watching her entire case go up in smoke, along with the barn. An hour later, it was over. The barn was a total loss, a smoking, skeletal ruin. But the house was saved. The tack room was damaged, but the fire had been stopped just feet from the kitchen wall. The dawn was breaking, a sick, gray light mixing with the orange embers and the black smoke. Silas Rudd had his prisoner, his face grim, tied to a fence post. He yanked the bandana from the man's face. "Rattler McKee." Silas spat, his voice full of disgust. "I should have known. I just set the fire," Rattler stammered, his eyes wide with fear. "That's all I did." The boss just wanted a distraction. "Distraction for what?" Rhett demanded, stepping forward, his face a thundercloud. "To get the bulls," Rattler whined. "The 5 breeding bulls. They was worth a fortune." "Who's your boss?" Silas asked, his voice deadly quiet. "I don't know. It was a setup. We was just supposed to sell 'em. To the man at the Saguaro Foundling Home, he pays top dollar for prime beef for his personal herd. No questions asked." The world went silent. June stared at Silas. Rhett stared at Silas. Prudence Fair, who had finally dismounted, froze, her face turning a waxy, pale color. This was not just rustling. This was a conspiracy that led directly back to the very institution that was supposed to save these children. The institution Prudence was their champion for. Silas Rudd looked from the cowering rustler to Mrs. Fair. His face was hard, the face of a man who finally understood the shape of the evil he was facing. He looked at June. She was standing there, soot on her face, her dress singed, her arm wrapped around a terrified wren. He looked at the smoking hole in her shoulder. His gaze, which had been conflicted, then respectful, now settled on her with something approaching awe. "Mrs. Fair," Silas said, his voice cold and official. "There has been a material change in this case. I am placing this man under arrest, not just for arson and rustling, but on suspicion of conspiracy with a territorial institution." He turned to June. "Ma'am, my investigation will begin immediately." As the sun came up, the full scope of the devastation was clear. The barn was gone, but the family was intact. Reverend Pike and May had taken the children inside. They were asleep, a pile of blankets and exhausted limbs on the parlor rug, the safest place in the house. June stood alone at the window, staring at the smoking, steaming ruins of the barn. Her body was a symphony of pain. Her shoulder throbbed, her lungs burned, and her hands were raw. She heard Rhett's bootsteps behind her. He said nothing. He simply took his own heavy denim coat from the peg and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth and weight of it were a comfort. His hand lingered on her good shoulder. Then his fingers moved, very gently, to the singed and ruined fabric on her other side. He didn't touch the skin, just the burned cloth, his touch a question. "Pippa?" June whispered, her voice a raw croak. She was under the manger. Rhett's breath hitched. He closed his eyes, the image of what could have happened playing out in his mind. He had been saving his livelihood. She had been saving his daughter. He stepped in front of her, forcing her to look at him. His face was black with soot, his eyes red from the smoke. He didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't say, "I love you." He didn't need to. His eyes said something far more powerful, a message forged in the heart of the inferno, when the world was on fire. You ran into it with me. I saw you choose to stay. Outside, the community members were not leaving. They were standing in the yard, drinking coffee May had brewed, their faces grim. Reverend Pike walked among them. He raised his hands. "The hearing is in 3 hours," he called out, his voice hoarse. "But the testimony has already been given. When that judge asks for witnesses, he will not just see a few of us. He will see all of us. They formed a circle, a silent, protective living wall around the small adobe house. Prudence Fair stood outside the circle. She looked at the community. She looked at the smoking barn, the captured rustler, the exhausted children. She looked at Rhett and June, who were now standing on the porch, his coat around her. A silent, unbreakable pair. For the first time in her adult life, Prudence Fair looked utterly and completely lost. Her book of rules, her black and white world, had just been burned to the ground. The Sable Mesa courthouse was not a hall of justice. It was a long, narrow adobe room, built to be a saloon and hastily converted. The air was thick, smelling of old tobacco, kerosene, and the fine, gritty dust that settled on everything. It was just 10 o'clock in the morning, but the heat was already oppressive. A single, 4-bladed fan, powered by a sputtering steam engine on the roof, clicked and groaned overhead, listlessly pushing the hot air around. Motes of dust danced in the sharp, bright beams of sunlight slanting through the high, narrow windows. At the front, on a platform of raw lumber, sat Judge Harlan Hemlock. He was a man carved from the same hard granite as the mesas, his face a map of harsh judgments, his beard a cloud of iron gray. He looked at the assembled crowd with eyes that had seen everything the territory had to throw at a man, and he was not impressed. On one side sat Prudence Fair, flanked by a thin, whey-faced lawyer from Santa Fe. She was dressed in her severe black, her face a mask of absolute, unbending righteousness. She had come for her pound of flesh. On the other side, on a hard wooden bench, sat the Blue Mesa family, Rhett Callahan. His face scrubbed clean, but his eyes red from smoke and lack of sleep. He wore his Sunday suit, a garment that looked painfully tight on his broad shoulders. Beside him was June Mercer. She wore her one good dress, the navy blue, now meticulously mended. Her singed hair was pulled back in a tight, neat bun, and a large, clean bandage covered her left shoulder, a stark white badge of honor against the dark fabric. Her satchel of evidence was at her feet. The children sat with them. Ash, his jaw set, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Wren, pale, holding her rolled-up map like a scepter. Tavo, his leg nervously bouncing. And Pippa, in June's lap, her eyes wide, clutching her one-eyed doll. The benches behind them were packed. May Travers, Reverend Pike, Dr. Inez Calderon, and a score of others. The 67 signatures from the petition were not just names on paper. They were bodies in the room. A silent, standing wall of witnesses. The court will hear the petition of the Territorial Benevolence Committee. Judge Hemlock's voice boomed, cutting through the heavy silence. The Santa Fe lawyer, a man named Finch, stood up, his reedy voice a stark contrast to the judge's. Your Honor, the matter is simple, as dictated by Territorial Mandate 74. The 4 children present are wards of the territory. Mr. Rhett Callahan is of no blood relation. His guardianship is illegal. He gestured to Prudence. Mrs. Fair, a decorated agent of the committee, attempted to enforce the mandate, which provides for the safe, structured transfer of these wards to the Saguaro Foundling Home, a state-of-the-art facility. Mr. Callahan and his associate, Miss Mercer, Finch sneered, have obstructed this legal transfer through a series of legal and social maneuvers. Prudence Fair stood then, her voice ringing with cold passion. Your Honor, this is not a home. It is a place of profound and proven danger. While under Mr. Callahan's care, these children have endured a life-threatening fall, a catastrophic flood, and, just last night, a violent arson attack that destroyed the main barn. She looked at the judge, her eyes wide with manufactured horror. We arrived to find the children running for their lives. The property in flames. This is not stability. This is chaos. The law exists to protect children from precisely this kind of negligent, hazardous environment. We demand the immediate enforcement of the transfer order. She sat down, a wave of self-satisfaction washing over her face. She had laid her trap, using the fire as her final, irrefutable proof. Judge Hemlock looked at the burn on June's shoulder, then at Rhett's soot-stained fingernails. He said nothing. "Mr. Callahan," the judge asked. Rhett stood, his great height seeming to suck the air from the room. He gripped the back of the bench. "Your Honor, I'm not a man of words." The lawyer, Finch, smirked. "But Miss Mercer is—" Rhett finished and sat down. All eyes turned to June. She stood and walked to the front of the room, her footsteps the only sound besides the clicking fan. She did not approach the judge with supplication. She approached him as a fellow professional. "Your Honor, my name is June Mercer. I am the children's teacher," she said, her voice clear and steady, reaching every corner of the room. "Mrs. Fair is correct. The Blue Mesa Ranch is a place of hardship. So is the New Mexico Territory. She sees chaos. We offer proof of resilience." She laid her satchel on the table. She did not present her case with emotion. She presented it with evidence. Mrs. Fair claims neglect. I present our household log." She handed a neat, leather-bound book to the bailiff, who gave it to the judge. "You will find a detailed weekly menu, confirming a nutritional regimen of protein, grain, and vegetables. You will also find a growth chart. When I arrived, Tavo Briggs was underweight. He has gained 4 pounds. Ash Cobb has grown 1.5 inches. These are not the statistics of neglected children." Finch started to rise, but the judge waved him down, his eyes scanning the pages. "Mrs. Fair claims a lack of structure." June continued. "I present our daily schoolhouse timetable, our formal gradebook, and their exercise slates. These children are not ward labor. They are students, excelling in arithmetic, geography, and penmanship. And as for the environment being hazardous," June's voice grew a shade warmer, "I present the formal, sworn testimony of Dr. Inez Calderon, confirming the excellent medical care and rapid healing of Wren Callahan following her accident." She placed the doctor's letter on the table. "And finally," June said, her voice gaining a quiet power, "Mrs. Fair claims Mr. Callahan stands alone. I present this." She unrolled the long scroll of paper, a petition, signed by 67 citizens of Juniper Bend and the surrounding spreads, attesting to the good character, stable home, and profound community bond of the Callahan family. She finished, leaving the scroll unfurled on the table, a testament of silent, damning consensus. "The court will hear from the children," Judge Hemlock said, his face unreadable. "Asher Cobb." Ash stood, his knees shaking, but his chin high. He walked to the judge's platform. "Son," the judge said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "tell me about living at the Blue Mesa Ranch." Finch stood. "Objection. The child is not a qualified witness." "Sit down, Mr. Finch," Hemlock barked. "I'll be the judge of that. Go on, son." Ash swallowed. "Sir, I've lived in places. A camp near the Brazos, a church cellar. I know what it is to be hungry. I know what it is to be cold." He looked at Rhett. "At Blue Mesa, I got my own bed. I got chores. I got homework." He said the word as if it were a point of pride. "And Pa Rhett, he don't just give us old boots. He took me to the store, and he had 'em fit me. He said a man can't work if his feet hurt." Ash's voice cracked. "Just once. And when I had the fever, Miss June, she sat up all night. She kept the cloth on my head. Nobody ever did that before. I ain't leaving. You can't make me." He walked back to his seat, his head high, and sat down. "Wren Briggs," the judge called. Wren walked up, clutching her rolled-up paper. "And what do you have there, young lady?" Wren unrolled her oil paper map. The judge's eyebrows shot up. "This is your flood map, Your Honor," she said, her voice small but clear. "I drew the weak points of the arroyo, and I mapped the safe path to high ground, so we never get trapped by the water again." "This is remarkable work," the judge murmured. "Who taught you to do this, to think like this?" Wren looked back at the bench. "Pa Rhett. He taught me to read the land. And Miss June, she taught me to put it on paper, so we can all remember. They taught me." As Wren returned to her seat, Dr. Calderon was called. Her testimony was sharp, precise, and utterly scathing, ending with her professional opinion that the Saguaro Foundling Home, given its remote location, could not provide even a fraction of the superior medical and psychological care the children were currently receiving. Reverend Pike was next. He spoke of the community. He spoke of the bridge raising. He held up the petition. "Your Honor," he concluded, "this is not a legal matter. It is a moral one. This is a family, forged not by blood, but by fire, by flood, and by a love that this entire community recognizes as true. To tear them apart would be a sin against God and man." A low murmur of "Amen" rumbled through the crowd. "The court will hear from Deputy Silas Rudd," the judge said. Silas stood, his face carved in stone. He walked to the front, no longer the conflicted young deputy. He was an officer of the court, and he was furious. "Your Honor, I was present at the fire last night. I was not there to inspect, but to investigate." Prudence Fair stiffened. "The fire was arson," Silas stated, his voice ringing. "It was set by a gang of rustlers led by a man named Rattler McKee, whom I apprehended at the scene. It was a diversion, designed to allow them to steal Mr. Callahan's breeding bulls." Finch leaped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is a tragedy, but it only proves our point. This man cannot even protect his—" "Mr. McKee confessed." "Your Honor," Silas cut in, his voice like ice. The courtroom went dead silent. "He confessed that he was hired for the job, and that he had a standing agreement to sell the stolen, unbranded stock to a single buyer. That buyer, sir, was the manager of the Saguaro Foundling Home in Santa Fe." A collective, horrified gasp sucked the air from the room. Prudence Fair shot to her feet, her face ashen. That is a lie, a desperate slander," she stammered. "Is it Mrs. Fair?" Silas's voice was cold. "Were you not the one who sent a wire to that very institution just yesterday to prepare transport? Were you, perhaps, coordinating logistics? Prudence was, for the first time, utterly lost." She looked at her lawyer, who was staring at his notes as if they could save him. She sat down, her entire case, her entire world, collapsing around her. "Your Honor," Silas concluded, "in light of this testimony, I formally request this court to suspend the transfer order indefinitely, pending a full territorial investigation into the criminal operations at the Saguaro Foundling Home." Judge Hemlock looked at Prudence Fair for a long, terrible moment. "Mrs. Fair," he said, his voice a low growl, "you will not leave Sable Mesa. You will be questioned by the deputy this afternoon." He turned his gaze back to Rhett and June. The room held its breath. The immediate threat was gone, but the legal status remained. The judge looked at the petition. He looked at the map. He looked at the burn on June's shoulder. "Mr. Callahan," the judge said, his voice softer now, "this court has heard testimony of a home built on courage and community. It has also heard testimony of an irregular arrangement. This is a court of law, and in the eyes of the law, this woman," he gestured to June, "has no formal claim. She is a hired hand." "She is my partner," Rhett said, his voice low. "Then why, sir?" the judge asked, his gaze piercing. "Have you not married her?" A shocked, excited murmur rippled through the crowd. June's head snapped up, her face flooding with color. May Travers covered her mouth. Rhett looked at the judge. Then he looked at June, his gaze locking with hers. A silent, powerful communication that shut out the entire room. He took a breath and stood, not to address the judge, but to address her. "Your Honor," Rhett said, his voice clear and strong, filled with a sudden, profound calm. "I have not asked Miss Mercer to marry me because of this hearing. I did not want her to think I was offering her a legal trick." He took a step away from the bench, into the open, standing before the judge and the whole town. "Marriage is an oath," he said, his eyes never leaving June's. "It is not a solution to a custody problem. It is a vow. A promise to stand together when the fires come and when the floods rise. A promise to be a home." He looked at Judge Hemlock. "But I will tell you this, sir. This court has granted me a stay. You have given my family a chance to breathe, and I intend to use that breath." He turned back to June, and the rough-hewn rancher disappeared, replaced by a man stripped bare to his soul. "If this court will allow us to go home," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "I intend to ask this woman to marry me. I will ask her not because I am afraid of the law, but because I am afraid of a life without her. I will ask her for love." The courtroom was so quiet. The clicking of the fan sounded like a hammer. June's eyes filled with tears. She had held back her fear, her pain, her grief, but she could not hold back this. She stood, and in front of the judge, the town, and the children, she did not speak. She simply closed the small gap between them, took his large, calloused, soot-stained hand in her own, and nodded, a single, definitive, silent yes that echoed louder than any shout. Judge Hemlock watched them for a long moment, a strange, soft light in his granite eyes. He cleared his throat, the sound like gravel. This court finds that the immediate transfer of the children would be an act of profound and irreversible harm." A sob of relief broke from May Travers. "This court hereby grants a temporary joint guardianship to Mr. Rhett Callahan and Miss June Mercer." The judge boomed. June's hand tightened on Rhett's. "Joint guardianship. The children will remain at the Blue Mesa Ranch, pending the outcome of a full territorial investigation into the ESA." He never finished the sentence. A high, joyous, piercing shriek cut him off. Pippa, who had understood nothing but the tension and the release, scrambled off the bench, threw her rag doll in the air, and yelled the one word that mattered. "Home! We're home!" The room erupted. The judge didn't even bother banging his gavel. The sound of people cheering, crying, and stamping their feet drowned out the law, drowned out the clicking fan, drowned out everything but the pure, unadulterated sound of joy. The wedding was not held in a church. It was held under the ancient, spreading arms of the great cottonwood tree by the creek, the one that had survived 100 years of storms and droughts. Its leaves, turning a brilliant, buttery yellow in the autumn sun, formed a natural cathedral. The community had brought their own benches and chairs, arranging them in a rough semicircle. The air smelled of drying grass, roast beef from May Travers's pit, and the clean, wild scent of the desert asters and goldenrod the children had gathered in buckets to decorate the aisle. Rhett stood waiting, not in a suit, but in his best dark trousers and a clean white shirt, a simple, brushed wool vest giving him a quiet dignity. His hair was slicked back with water, and his hands, though scrubbed raw, could not hide the lifetime of work etched into them. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors, at the community that had stood with him, and his heart was a full, aching thing in his chest. Then, the small crowd fell silent. June appeared from the house. She was not escorted by a father or a brother. She walked alone, a testament to the journey she had made by herself. She wore a simple dress the color of fresh cream, one she had painstakingly sewn in the quiet evenings after the hearing. Her hair was not in its usual tight bun, but was woven into a soft, simple braid, with a few stems of purple aster tucked into it. She carried no bouquet. Her hands were empty, open, ready to receive. As she walked toward him, she did not look at the crowd. She looked only at him, and in her eyes, he saw not just love, but a profound and peaceful certainty. He saw his home, walking toward him. Ash stood beside his father, a small, serious best man. He held not a velvet pillow, but a small, smooth, river-washed stone. Resting on it were 2 rings of simple, polished copper, which Rhett had forged himself in the quiet hours of the night, hammering his love and his promise into the warm, glowing metal. Reverend Pike stood before them, his Bible open, but he did not read from it at first. "We are gathered here today," he said, his voice carrying on the crisp autumn air. Not merely to witness a marriage, but to affirm a family. A family we have all seen forged in the fires of adversity and tested in the waters of tribulation. The law of the territory has recognized this bond. Now, we recognize it in the eyes of God and of this community. He looked at Rhett. Your vows. Rhett took a deep breath. He had practiced no flowery words, no memorized poetry. He spoke the plain, unvarnished truth of his heart. He took June's hands in his. "June Mercer," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer fought to conceal. "Before you came, this house was just a place to sleep. You made it a home. You taught my children to read, but you taught me how to hope again." He swallowed, his gaze locked on hers. "I can't promise you a life without hardship. This land is hard. But I make this vow every morning you wake in my house. You will know you are needed, and you will know you are loved." Tears streamed silently down June's face, but she was smiling. The Reverend nodded to her. "Rhett Callahan," she began, her voice a soft, clear bell. "I came here with nothing but a single valise and a heart that I thought was broken beyond repair. You and the children, you showed me that a family is not something you are born into. It is something you build. It is a house you make together." Her grip on his hands tightened. "I cannot promise to take away the burdens of this life, but I make this vow every night you come home from the pasture or the forge. You will find a lamp lit in the window, waiting for you. You will never be alone in the dark again." Ash stepped forward and held up the stone. Rhett took one ring and slid it onto June's finger. June took the other and slid it onto his. The copper was warm from the sun. Then, by the grace of God and with the blessing of this community, Reverend Pike declared, his own eyes shining, "I pronounce you man and wife." Rhett didn't wait for the traditional instruction. He framed her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "My June," he whispered, a name that was now a statement of fact, and he kissed her. It was a kiss that held all the unspoken words, all the shared fears, and all the hard-won triumphs of their journey. It was soft and deep and warm, a kiss of profound gratitude and boundless, hopeful love. It was not the desperate, confirming kiss in the firelight. This was a kiss of pure, unadulterated joy, shared under the open sky, sealed by the cheers of their children and the wild, happy applause of their friends. He held her, his strong arm wrapped around her back, her hand resting on his cheek, a perfect, safe, and incandescent picture of a family finally made whole. Their wedding night was not spent in a fancy hotel or a faraway city. It was spent in the heart of their home, the kitchen. After the last neighbor had ridden away, after the children were finally asleep, their dreams filled with cake and celebration, Rhett built up the coals in the great iron stove until they glowed a soft, pulsing crimson. There was no music, only the gentle chirp of crickets outside the open window and the whisper of the dying embers. He held out his hand to her, just as he had done that first night by the fire. She took it without hesitation. He led her to the center of the clean-swept floor, and they began to dance. It was a slow, shuffling circle, a dance with no steps. Her head rested in the hollow of his shoulder, his chin resting on the top of her hair. They didn't speak. They simply moved together, a single, silent rhythm. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her cheek. He could feel the soft, even whisper of her breath. He stopped dancing and just held her, his arms wrapped around her, his chin still resting on her head. She tilted her face up to his, and the smile she gave him was full of a soft, wondrous peace. The firelight played in her eyes, and he saw his whole world there. His hand was gentle on her back, a gesture of pure, protective love, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He had fought floods and fires for this quiet, for this peace, for this woman in his arms. It was a night built not on passion, but on the profound, unshakable intimacy of two souls who had found their safe harbor. A week later, a letter arrived from Sable Mesa. It bore the seal of the circuit court. June opened it with trembling fingers. It was the judge's final ruling. The investigation into the Saguaro Foundling Home had uncovered a rot that went deep, and the institution's charter had been suspended. The letter concluded based on the overwhelming evidence of a stable, loving, and supportive environment, and in accordance with the established best interest of the child. This court hereby grants permanent, undisputed, and sole guardianship of the minors Asher Cobb, Wren and Tavo Briggs, and Pippa Callahan to Mr. and Mrs. Rhett Callahan. The case is closed. Life at the Blue Mesa Ranch settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. June officially opened her school. The porch was no longer big enough. On Fridays, the yard filled with children from the neighboring spreads. They came bearing payment in the currency of the frontier: a dozen fresh eggs, a bar of homemade soap, a sack of beans. Knowledge spread through Juniper Bend like a summer rain, and June's name was spoken with a reverence usually reserved for doctors and preachers. Wren's flood map was copied and hung in the general store, a public service for the whole community. Ash, using his modular pen design, became his father's right hand, a young man of quiet competence who led the cattle with an easy, confident authority. Tavo, his energy now channeled, spent his afternoons at the forge, learning to shape hot iron, his small hammer ringing in time with his father's. And Pippa, the child of silence and tears, could now be heard on the porch, sitting on June's lap, proudly and loudly spelling her own name, Pippa. One afternoon, May Travers sat on the porch with June, watching the children play. "You know," May said, shaking her head in wonder, "it's a funny thing. A family doesn't need the same blood to look alike. They just need to all be looking in the same direction." That evening, the sun hemorrhaged light across the western sky, spilling crimson and soft gold over the mesas. It was the same relentless, beautiful sky that had greeted June on her first day. She stood on the porch, leaning against the post, watching the children chase fireflies in the twilight. Rhett came up behind her, silent as always. He didn't speak, just wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned her head back, resting it on his shoulder. Their hands found each other, their fingers lacing together. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the small, dancing lights of the children in the dusk. He leaned his head close to her ear, his voice a low, warm, teasing rumble. "You know," he whispered, a smile in his voice, "you told me you couldn't have children." He paused, letting the memory of that first, painful confession hang in the air between them. "Good," he finished, his voice soft with a love so deep it was the very foundation of their world. "I've got enough kids for both of us." June closed her eyes and turned, pressing her cheek against the solid, warm wall of his chest. She listened to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart, a rhythm that was now the rhythm of her own life. She listened to the distant, happy laughter of the children in the yard, and she finally, completely, understood. A true home wasn't built of adobe and pine. It was built of love, and of all the times you stood together and refused to be broken by the storm. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help even more, please hit the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.